Sorry. Welcome to everybody. We're delighted to have you here. This is, I think, the 13th of our joint conferences that we've done with JETRO. This is a wonderful partnership. We are grateful for Ishige-san's stewardship of JETRO and his partnership with us. I will report to you that he on the flight over from Japan, he was impaired by some bug. So, but he forced his way to get up here today, and he's going to be with us. And I say thank you for your stamina. You know, you just travel too much. So we hope that you're going to be with us as much as possible today, and we're grateful for your being here. Before we begin, we always start with a little safety announcement. I just want to let you know that if anything were to happen, you'll hear a big voice that'll give you instructions to leave. We'll go through these exits right behind me. This one is the one that's closest to the stairs that take us down to the street level. We'll take 2 left-hand turns and a right, and we'll meet over in the courtyard of National Geographic. We have a mutual agreement with them so that we can help each other if we need to. There won't be any problem, but just please follow instructions. Mike Green is the responsible safety officer today, so if he asks you to do something, please follow his instructions. I'm very pleased that Congressman Larson can be with us today. You know, I think it's partly because he is from the West Coast, from the state of Washington, that he has just a transcending interest in Asia. And he has been a champion within the Democratic caucus as well as with the China caucus for helping the Congress, the House of Representatives, understand Asia. This is reflected in his service on the Armed Services Committee, but also he's the chairman of the Aviation Subcommittee, or the ranking member of the Aviation Subcommittee. Maybe chairman next year. I just don't know when that's going to happen. But we're delighted to have him here because he's one of the most thoughtful, reflective members of Congress that steps back. You know what, politicians are caught in a daily interaction that's all about right here and now. And he's one of the few members that can step back and look at the larger sweep of what's happening in the world, America in the world, our allies in the world, Japan. And he's going to share some of that with us today. He's a perfect way to begin a conference on these topics. I mean, there's a lot in flux right now. Are we going to have a U.S.-Japan free trade agreement? Or is America going to simply abandon the field on TPP and let the rest of the world move forward with it? What happens to the other coordination mechanisms like RCEP in Asia? I mean, where does all of that go? These are all big questions up in the air, and we're going to dig into them today. No one could get us off to a better start than Congressman Rick Larson. Please welcome him with your applause. Thank you.
Thanks, John. It's always a pleasure to be here. It's also difficult to always have to correct my host because he said I'm from the West Coast, from Washington State. And we like to think that we're the Pacific Northwest because when people hear the West Coast, they really are talking about California. They're not talking about where I'm from. So we're a bit particular about that. That's our thing, not your thing. But appreciate being here this morning. Just a quick announcement for those of you who might have heard news this morning. There was a shooting at the baseball practice for the Republicans in preparation for tomorrow's congressional baseball game. And so far as I know, and it's all on the news, that there's 2 police officers shot. There was 2 staffers, we believe, and then House Majority Whip Scalise was shot as well. Everybody seems to be in stable condition. The shooter they have the shooter, and that's as much news as I know. But for those who maybe heard about it this morning, perhaps sitting here wondering what happens next, that's the latest update. So if you're on the Capitol complex today, there will be an increased police presence there, but everything is open. People are coming and going, tourists will come and go, but there will be an increased presence of police officers there. So I do want to give folks an update and just keep the folks who've been shot in your prayers as well. You know, heck of a way to start the morning, but I did want to pass that information on to folks. That's as much as I know right now. But so with that, I want to thank you though for having me here. I want to thank John for starting us off, and I I want to keep my remarks relatively brief, but we have about 30 minutes, I think, if I'm not mistaken. After I'm done, then Michael's going to moderate some questions, moderate the audience for questions. So for those who don't know me, I'm Rick Larson from Washington State's 2nd District. I'm going to put that on a map. It's north of Seattle and none of Seattle. That's the way to think about it. And in the Northwest, we focus, our focus there is not only on Asia, but in Washington State, we have really strong economic and diplomatic relationships with our neighbors in Asia. As a result of that interest for my state, I helped found and am still the co-chair of the U.S.-China Working Group. And this year we celebrated our 12th year on Capitol Hill. And our job is really to increase the awareness, continually increase the awareness about issues related to between the United States and China, and honestly, the entire region. In that vein, this year, I've been to Singapore, Japan, and Korea. In a couple of weeks, I'm headed to a marathon trip to New Zealand, Australia, Vietnam, and Korea again. And then Alaska, which is not a country, but don't tell them that. In the spring, when we went to Japan, I had an opportunity to meet with Prime Minister Abe, along with 11 other members of Congress. And on the trip, I would just note in this conversation about a free trade agreement, he seemed to characterize a trade agreement with the United States as something that he could take a wait-and-see approach to. And I don't blame him for his hesitations to embrace negotiating with the United States right now. We are certainly have a heavy presence. The United States has a heavy presence in Asia, but it is increasingly a hard power presence through military presence. But we also need to step up our game on the soft power side, whether that's cultural exchange with education, but certainly trade and the economic relationships are important as well. And I'm trying to implement that vision a little bit in Congress as the co-chair of a trade task force for a group called the New Dems, New Democrat Coalition. The New Dems consist of about 61 Democrats, consistently pro-economic growth, pro-trade, pro-education investment. And this group has really been proven essential to promoting and passing trade deals in Congress, including a fateful 28 of us who voted for TPA, Trade Promotion Authority, last year. So much so that even President Obama called us the TPA 28. We sort of had our own nickname, which had its ups and downs to it, honestly. But trade is partly, trade policy does stand alone in many respects, but also it needs to be seen as part of our in our diplomatic toolkit as well. And trade is about setting the rules of the road in the future for how we trade, and has to be more than about tariffs and more than a discussion about tariffs. And thinking of trade only as tariffs, as this administration, I would argue, seems to be doing, is a very 80s viewpoint on trade. And by the 80s, I mean the 1880s. If you do, I know there's been a little sarcasm there, but if you look at some of the numbers, tariff numbers the administration has threatened, you go back to the 1880s, and that's about what those tariff numbers were. It really is an approach that is a bygone approach. So when I was in Japan and during my other travels in the region, I've heard the same important message from folks that TPP, and I don't try to relive those days of TPP oh so long ago, but that TPP was not just about tariffs as much as it was about establishing high standards and the rules of the road for trade in the region. And to fill the void that I believe the current administration is leaving, I've started the APEC caucus, so that there's a group in Congress solely dedicated to looking at economic cooperation in the Asia Pacific. And so I'm launching this caucus along with Congressman Reichert, also from Washington State, and we're launching that very soon. As well, I joined Congresswoman Rice and Congressman Donovan and Reichert in working to permanently authorize the APEC travel business card program. And so we're working on the reauthorization, permanently authorizing that program in the next few days. And as far as the administration is concerned, though, I believe the first order of business to determine who is going to, let's see, hold on. As far as the administration is concerned, I believe the first order of business is to determine who is going to be their point person on trade, especially since NAFTA renegotiations officially begin in August. There seems to be certainty in the various agencies about who will be the lead on trade, but that's because each of the agencies believe they'll be the lead on trade. There's some ambiguity who will be the lead on trade, whether it will be Commerce or the U.S. Trade Rep's office. And I certainly believe it's important to keep the USTR as a diplomatic arm on trade, and because of that role, it's important that the new USTR hire up his own staff as soon as possible now, so we can start working on trade objectives for this administration, not just for NAFTA renegotiation, but in the future. And so the first objective, I think, that for USTR ought to be then to establish those trade principles that are not protectionist. They're not only about tariffs, although tariffs can be important, as I noted, but the future of trade is not about tariffs. These trade principles need to be fundamentally different from the ones, I think, that were sent out in February that did things like question the very importance of the World Trade Organization. I'm also suggesting the administration look to TPP when writing new trade deals. TPP was a 21st century trade deal. Of course, by definition, any trade deal done in the 21st century would have been a 21st century trade deal. More importantly, it was a trade deal that had higher standards and addressed issues that we hadn't addressed before in trade deals, like state-owned enterprises, like digital trade, intellectual property. It also had important environmental and labor language in the text of the deal, not as side agreements. Now, in contrast to the previous administration, the new president does seem to be favoring bilateral trade agreements over multilateral trade agreements, and I just think this is a huge mistake. There are many people who make very good arguments why we ought to do bilaterals. I think I can make very good arguments why we should do multilaterals. First of all, bilaterals will grow up to be multilaterals, so why not start where you're going to end up? I think as well, because the world is so interconnected, global connections exist, the supply chain is global, it'll be very difficult, more difficult than ever, to determine rules of origin. It'd be easier to address rules of origin concerns if you have multilaterals than if you have bilaterals. Things in Vietnam often have parts from Malaysia, from China, and New Zealand, and other places around the world, as an example. Second, it's harder to negotiate bilaterals, I would argue. For example, while negotiating TPP, the U.S. could use a coalition of a majority of other countries to get what it needed in the agreement, especially on important issues like labor and environment. We simply don't have that advantage in bilaterals. And finally, negotiating only bilaterals sets up a system of winners and losers that will not get us very far diplomatically. So moving away from multilaterals and withdrawing from TPP, I think, in my view, leaves Asia questioning U.S. leadership in the region. When the president withdrew from TPP, others, like Fareed Zakaria from CNN, said the U.S. essentially just handed Asia to China on a platter, and this is a sentiment I agree with. Like I said before, trade should be about setting the rules of the road. TPP largely was going to do that, and the U.S. was at the forefront of setting those rules. And now instead, China seems to be at the forefront of setting those rules with this RCEP negotiation. And those rules would look very different in many different ways than if the TPP was being pursued. So I would just note that this is just, it's more important than just trade, it's more important than just diplomacy. In fact, it's just more important than the U.S. hard power presence in the region. From my point of view, this is about a larger commitment that the U.S. should continue to make to a international rules-based order. The one that, honestly, I believe the U.S. Helped create after World War II, helped sustain for the last 70 years, and has been a leader. And I hope there are other countries who will step up and lead on the international rules-based order if the U.S. seems to be stepping back, but I'm not convinced that that will happen. And so I think that it is extremely important that the U.S. think more broadly about its role in the world, certainly in Asia, and about its long-term commitment to the rules-based order that we spend a lot of time creating and sustaining. And to do that, I think, requires us to move away from where it seems to be going in terms of our negotiations. That is about focusing strictly on transactions, a transactional relationship with countries, as opposed to something broader and something more strategic. Focusing on tit-for-tat approaches rather than on win-win approaches. And the negotiations with Canada and Mexico will, honestly, I believe, be a good representation of how this administration will proceed and how it will treat other countries. So I want to finish my remarks on what I would do to support the administration's trade agenda, because I don't want to just be a killjoy here. But I think this administration seems to be carrying out the continued work of President Obama's administration's legacy on trade enforcement. And I think it's very important, certainly important from a domestic policy perspective, that the administration continue to pursue trade enforcement so that our voters, our constituents, do see that if we do trade deals, that we are going to enforce those trade deals. It's very important if you, again, then want to continue to move forward on more trade deals. We have to see the value of trade deals, not just in terms of the jobs it creates or the products that we get access to, but if if countries are breaking those rules, then there's an enforcement mechanism for that. Trade deals should be enforced. All countries in trade deals should uphold their end of the bargain. I helped, along with many others, support legislation to create a trust fund to pay for enforcement actions against other countries that break trade rules. So all this is very important. I just would conclude by noting my district again, that I get to see the big picture on trade every day. In Washington State alone, 40% of the jobs in my state are trade dependent, directly tied to trade. Probably in my district it's much higher because we build a lot of airplanes in my district, and 80% of those airplanes end up with foreign air carriers, not domestic air carriers. And Washington's economy, as a result, Washington State's economy feels the impact of these trade agreements every day in a very real and tangible way. So it's important to me that this administration and any administration get trade right and to start acknowledging the benefits of trade. So I'll leave you with this. My hope is that trade rules established by this administration do look like more of those under TPP, because we can't set the rules for the 21st century on trade with an approach to trade that I have argued was meant for the 19th century. So with that, thank you.
Thank you. I'm Mike Green from CSIS. And Congressman Larson, thank you. Frankly, one of the most honest and strategic talks on trade we've had here in a long time. And I know I speak for a lot of people when I say thank you for that, and also thank you for your leadership on Asia and on trade in the Congress. The question I want to ask is about the future of the political constellation around trade. So Winston Churchill reportedly said you can count on the Americans to do all the wrong things before they do the right things, and we're now in the process of doing all the wrong things. But over half of Americans, 60% in some polls, support free trade. By my count, 49 governors were in favor of TPP. The support for trade, of course, goes up the younger people are in this country. Yeah. You know, if you just look at it as a collection of interests, there's a robust constituency for your agenda for free trade. But of course, the politics now are all upside down and topsy-turvy. So it's hard to know how this will come out, but could you speculate how the nation, the Congress, gets back on track? What kind of things have to happen to tap what I think is quite strong subterranean support for engagement with the world and with trade? Yeah,
thanks. So there's a very long answer to that, which I won't get into, but it's a very long answer. I think the First and foremost is the language we use. Like you say free trade, a lot of folks say free trade. I actually try not to say free trade because we've never had a free trade agreement. We call them free trade, but if you look at them, there's plenty of things that aren't free trade about free trade agreements. There's still barriers in free trade agreements. There's still tariffs in free trade agreements. So it might be getting us towards that. So I think the language is important to let folks know that to talk more about trade. And as well, free trade and fair trade, those are weighted, those have a lot of load on them that people just kind of, actually voters especially, I could tell you, kind of recoil from. So talking about trade is important, but talking about trade as trade and the benefits of it. But I think put it in a strategic sense too. The president will argue that we have just been getting hoodwinked on trade agreements. That's kind of the basis of the argument then to go out and renegotiate some of these things in the way he wants to do it. But I think there's a different way to look at it, is that many of these countries that we trade with and many that we don't still want to, they want to be with the United States and they want to be the United States. They still look to the United States as a leader in the world. They want to have trade agreements with us. They want us to be around. And I think we also need to talk more about grabbing that mantle a little bit more aggressively, being a leader in the world, being what some countries want us to be, as opposed to just looking at things as a win or lose situation, a zero-sum game. The third thing, I guess, in the policy side, so I mean, there's some strategic messaging about this, but on the policy side is that we talk about trade policy usually alone. We don't talk about it in terms of what else can we do to help the economy. And I think in the future, we need to have, in the 90s, the Clinton folks called it parallel policies, but the idea that trade policy is supposed to create jobs, actually, it can, and maybe sometimes it does, maybe it doesn't. But what are we doing otherwise? We need to think about the future of work in the United States. What can we do to invest differently in education and training, in apprenticeships, and training the next generation of workforce for the next generation of work? And those are some policy headlines. There's a lot of detail to that you all can get into if you'd like later. But alleviating the concern that people have about trade does require us to change how we think about work and how we train people for the future of work, to be flexible, to understand that, like when I talk to my son, who's going to be an engineer, so I hope that they teach you one thing in your engineering degree. He goes, what's that? That the world is changing, that you're competing not with your classmates, you're competing with people around the world. And if you learn that one thing, that should be plenty for you to be employed for the rest of your life. Maybe not in the same job, but put it in some context. So there's just a different conversation we have to have around trade so that people feel a little more comfortable that we know what we're doing.
Thank you, and point well taken on how we talk about it. We'll take a few questions if you have time still. Chris?
It's coming.
Okay, thanks. Chris Nelson, Nelson Report. Thanks so much.
Hey,
it's always great to hear you. Let me get into the weeds a bit on TPP in terms of as you wander the halls of Congress and sit on the floor, what are you hearing from our Republican friends about how they're looking at what's happening with TPP, the TPP 11, or what our Singaporean friends call the organ harvest? Yeah. It looks like, led by Japan and Vietnam and others, that they're going to try to keep it going. Are your colleagues paying attention to that? Is there going to be a, if not trickle down, some kind of pressure building to keep TPP alive in some way? There seems to be a lot of Republican support for it, but are they actually watching what's happening over there, and what might, for a change, what's happening over there actually influence what happens here?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks. I think it would be fair to say that those folks who are interested in trade are in fact tracking what's going on with the TPP 11, but that we aren't at a point in Congress, Democratic or Republican, to be jumping on that bandwagon or even buying a ticket for the bus for that. The focus, the administration's been clear, and administrations get to drive the agenda, that they want to renegotiate NAFTA first. So I think that question of renegotiation and the content of that renegotiation, and frankly the result of it, will feed the answer to your question better. We're not at a point where we're going to be, I don't think anyone could give you a legitimate answer about how to approach, how to think about the other TPP countries moving forward, because we're not there in Congress. We're focused on NAFTA renegotiation right now. But for those who are following it, I mean, obviously it's in the back of our minds, in the forefront of our minds. We are watching it. I'm hopeful, and I've talked to a few folks just the last couple of days about this, that if this does go forward, if TPP 11 does go forward, that those values, those rules of the road that the U.S. worked so hard and worked with partners to get into TPP stay there, that it maintains its high standards, and it's not seen as, moving forward, is not seen as an excuse to back away from those standards.
Quick follow-up. I understand TPP is not available for, riding the bus, buying the tickets,
Sure,
planning the vacation. But senior people in the administration have expressed a clear interest in a bilateral FTA with Japan. And as you probably heard when you were in Tokyo, there is some interest, or at least some consideration of whether that would work in Japan.
Right.
What's the mood on that bilateral approach?
Yeah. Well, there's first and foremost, I'd have to say that I don't want countries to sort of, sorry about all these ridiculous analogies I'm coming up with, start buying the lottery ticket and hope they get selected for the first bilateral, because I don't think that that's how this is going to play out. That is it going to be the UK after they leave, after the Brexit, or is it going to be Japan, or is it going to whoever? The first, it looks like, it's going to be the renegotiation of NAFTA. That's going to be first. But I think that my impression from being in Japan and talking to the folks we got a chance to talk to is that Japan is going to take a wait-and-see approach even on a bilateral, for a couple reasons. One, the United States has not outlined what our trade objectives would be. And so, I mean, why would you jump into something where you don't know what your partner is going to, you don't have an idea what your partner might do? And that's first. Second, I'm trying to put myself in Japan's shoes in the great tradition of Uri and Fisher, who wrote a book about international negotiation by, put yourself in the other person's shoes. If I'm Japan, I'm thinking a bilateral with the United States is going to be about rice and cars. It's not going to be anything strategic. So show me something that's beyond that, if I'm Japan, and then I'll consider what we ought to do. Having said that, I know Vice President Pence and as a Prime Minister or Deputy Prime Minister also have an economic dialogue, and that is where a lot of this conversation will initially take place. Eventually, well, possibly then moving into some discussion about bilaterals, but right now, just sort of trying to define how we want to have this how we want to grow this economic relationship.
Great, Congressman, thank you. You've really launched us on a good trajectory for today. Really appreciate it. I know it's a busy time. Can you please join me in thanking the Congressman for his remarks?
Thanks a lot.
So I'll just step up here briefly to introduce Mr. Ishige, the chairman of JETRO, the Japan External Trade Relations Organization. Ishige-san has impressive career in the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, which partway through his career became the Ministry of External Trade and Industry, or Economy, Trade and Industry, METI. In fact, right when I was publishing a book about METI, they changed their name to METI, delaying my book by 6 months. But he's been there for all of it, and he has been at the helm of JETRO for years now, and is a veteran of this conference, and always opens up with some strategic presentations on where the region's going and where Japanese trade strategy is going. So, Ishige-san, thank you. I know you had a rough flight over, but we're really delighted you're here with us. Thanks very much. Please.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to express my sincere gratitude to all of you for joining us today. I would also like to give my thanks to Dr. Hamre and Dr. Green, as well as their colleagues at CSIS for their continued dedicated work on this forum. Before going into today's topic, I would like to convey our heartfelt condolences to the victims of the shooting in Virginia. I hope they got well soon, and best wishes for a speedy recovery. Having said that, this is actually the sixth time for me to speak here at the prestigious institution CSIS. Time truly flies. Last year, like every year, I stressed that the early ratification of the TPP is critical. But we all know what happened in the end. To tell the truth, however, I feel a little relieved now. Why? If the TPP went into effect, what do I have to talk about? I was afraid CSIS would not invite me back anymore. Well, thanks to your president, I'm sorry, those worries were unfounded. And I still have an excuse to come back to Washington that I love very much. I envy all of you here. The TPP is kind of job security for me in Washington. How about you? I can imagine that I'm not alone in this boat. But all joking aside, it's a great pleasure to be here with all of you again. For years, economic integration was recognized as necessary for the Asia-Pacific, and its first logical step was the TPP. This is what I advocate here at CSIS every year. However, as I said, we all know what happened this year. There is much uncertainty in the world today. Japan, however, still attaches great importance to free trade. Japan is still enthusiastic about promoting economic integration. In fact, Japan ratified the TPP last November. This is because economic integration facilitates domestic reform and economic growth. The TPP has changed the mindset of policymakers in Japan. It also allows real benefit to be shared by every country. Today, I will speak on 4 topics. What's happening in Asia with regard to economic integration, then what's happening in China. I will also touch on expectation for the US, and eventually, inclusiveness are the key factor for trade liberalization. First, what's happening in Asia? Among the 3 major economic zones of Asia, the EU, and NAFTA, only Asia has seen growth in intra-regional trade, and only Asia has seen steady economic integration. And Asia has now become the world's center of economic growth. This is thanks to economic integration. Further, it is clear that this benefits the US as well. For example, export from the US to Asia continues to grow. Asian economic growth boosts the US production networks. Its growing market consumes more American products. America is also rapidly expanding investment in ASEAN. A recent survey of US companies in ASEAN showed their optimism, 87% to increase business in ASEAN over the next 5 years. The momentum of Asia's economic integration and development will continue, and it will have a significant effect on the US economy. Here, in this slide, I would like to single out one trend in particular. Recently, innovation has become a major keyword in Asia. It is said to be the key ingredient in the region's economic growth. In Asia, e-commerce and fintech have been flourishing just as they have here. However, innovation has given birth to an Asian-style business model. A good example of this is Gojek in Indonesia. Gojek started as just a taxi service application for smartphones. It then grew by adding on-demand food delivery, on-demand courier, on-demand shopping services. These services are quite important in the aging society. Customers can even make payment through their smartphones. With ideas as its own ammunition, the tiny smartphone has created business on a gigantic scale. Its use requires no other infrastructure. This has allowed it to spread to every corner of each Asian country, even to rural areas. Innovation in Asia means utilizing trends on massive scale beyond borders across regions. In the past, it was mainly only large companies which could expand business overseas. But today, innovation enables SMEs to do so as well. In fact, in Asia, markets are growing much faster than rules can be made. However, we can't rely on the market mechanisms alone. No market can properly function without rules or frameworks. And these rules and frameworks in Asia should have high standards. I would like to emphasize that high standards are required. This year, ASEAN will celebrate the 50th anniversary of its establishment. In tandem with the formation of the ASEAN Economic Community in 2015, there has been a rising momentum toward economic integration. I'm speaking of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP. This is a free trade agreement between ASEAN and its 6 FTA partners in Asia and the Pacific. We should ensure RCEP is achieved with high standards. This is critically important. How about China? This January, China's president took part in the Davos meeting for the first time. He stated in the opening remark, plenary, we will steadily and unwaveringly move forward toward economic globalization. This is significant. These words came from the president of China, not America. This March, China declared its intent to promote the establishment of the FTAP by concluding RCEP as soon as possible. This May, China hosted a forum involving 70 international organizations and 130 countries to promote its One Belt, One Road initiative. This initiative may come into harmony with the free and fair Trans-Pacific Economic Zone. This might be possible if it adopts international standards for infrastructure development. China's goals appears to be economic development involving nearly every region of the world. I think China is driven by 2 major policies. One is the One Belt, One Road initiative. The other is a global free trade network based on RCEP and FTAP. Now, I would like to move on to the third topic, expectation for the US. As a growing region, Asia will provide plenty of business opportunities. In this regard, what is the stance of Japan? Japan's stance for economic integration in Asia is very simple. Japan is pushing forward with the TPP, seeking high-level economic integration in Asia. I think Japan has similar hopes for RCEP. RCEP should also be high-level. Economic integration across the borders is already a reality in Asia. So, how do we ensure free and fair trade in this new market. I would like to give my opinion. First, in order to enjoy the fruits of the growing Asian market, we need free and fair trade rules with high standards. And these need to be able to cover the Asian market as a whole. The market should be accessible to all companies, large and small. Second, I believe the answer is the TPP. Third, we want an economic framework based on fair rules in which the US is actively involved. In this regard, I would like to ask you a question. How many of you have heard of the TPP 11? Not Ocean's 11. Could we have a show of hands? Oh, quite a few. TPP 11 is being pursued by Japan and the 10 remaining members of the TPP. Their intent is to realize the TPP as soon as possible. That is one reason for this. We are hoping for the US to return to the TPP. We are hoping for the US to return to the TPP. In the G7 summit last month, Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe said the following: "We will expand a fair market across the board, which is free and based on rules. Japan will continue to take leadership in promoting free trade based on fair rules." Meanwhile, as I just mentioned, China is pursuing RCEP and the One Belt, One Road initiative. China is eager to fill the gap left by America's pivot from Asia. Well then, how will America respond? Will the US try to negotiate agreements on a country-by-country basis? I'm afraid this would consume enormous time and energy. How many opportunities could be lost as a result? The US has been a leader in international rulemaking for liberalized and fair market. This includes trade-related rules concerning the environment, labor, and intellectual property rights. This ensured that US companies had a fair chance to compete in the Asia-Pacific. And as integration in Asia continues, the US has been working to strengthen value chains originating in Asia. As you can see here, both leaders share good chemistry, very good picture. I would like to touch on cooperation between the US and Japan. Following the US-Japan summit meeting this February, a joint statement was released. Both countries advocated for closer trade and investment ties. Both countries advocated for high standard rules throughout the Asia-Pacific. High standard rules throughout the Asia-Pacific. We are moving toward the same direction. We are moving toward the same purpose. The Asia-Pacific can still benefit from American leadership. I think that ASEAN is a good example. While ASEAN continues to enjoy growth, some problems still exist. These include state-owned enterprises. The playing field needs to be leveled so that private companies can compete. Reform of customs procedures and deregulation of foreign investment are also necessary. America once encouraged countries like Vietnam and Malaysia to do just that in preparation for the TPP. America can still urge other countries to reform by offering access to the US market as leverage. I believe this is how we can solve these common issues related to economic integration across the Asia-Pacific. This brings me to my final topic today. A fundamental and unavoidable question is whether we can continue to promote economic integration and trade liberalization as we have done so far. In other words, what is the key for sustainable economic integration? What is the key for trade liberalization? The answer is inclusiveness. Around the world, we have seen a growing anger or resentment over globalization. This anger is over an obvious inequality between people who benefit from globalization and those who do not. Ensuring that no one is left behind by globalization is a common challenge for all countries. And in fact, governments can pursue economic integration together with economic development, which is inclusive. For example, as I mentioned, we at JETRO support Japanese SMEs, which are less competitive than large companies. In cooperation with local governments, banks, and chambers, we do this by utilizing our worldwide network. This has helped more than 5,000 SMEs expand their business overseas. We have also dispatched more than 400 experts among SMEs to prepare them for overseas market. Not female staff only, of course, men. This support for SMEs is part of Japan's mission to ensure that no one is left behind. I heard that US also has safety nets, such as Trade Adjustment Assistance, or TAA. This is a program which helps workers who have lost their jobs due to the impact of free trade. There are also programs to re-educate workers to find a new employment. Yes, the system is splendid. However, the implementation seems to be inadequate. We learned that many of the American people who voted for Mr. Trump on election day were those who were left behind. They expected that Mr. Trump would lend a helping hand. I believe that the US can ensure that all Americans benefit from an open door policy as long as it follows an inclusive domestic policy. Fewer people will oppose economic globalization if we spread benefits through a fair distribution of income. All workers, not just corporate managers and investors, should benefit from globalization. As I mentioned earlier, everyone in Asia is trying to capitalize on global business opportunities by forming rules. There are various frameworks in Asia. China pursues RCEP and the One Belt, One Road initiative. Japan pursues the TPP and aspires to create the RCEP with higher standards and rules. ASEAN pursues AEC and RCEP, and within ASEAN, at least Vietnam and Singapore still promote the TPP. Last week, this slide shows the Vietnamese Prime Minister, Mr. Phuc, said at a seminar actually hosted by JETRO in Tokyo that globalization is an inevitable process. And Vietnam still endorses the TPP. He also made this clear to me directly in conversation. Now, I would like to raise two topic questions for the following panel discussion. The first question is, how will the US respond to these various policies of Asia? What will Asian countries do? The second question is how we ensure that no one is left behind. Likewise, how can we pursue domestic reform? Asia is currently enjoying the fruits of economic growth. But what if vulnerable groups are excluded from the benefits of free trade? Could protectionism rise in Asia as it has in the US and Europe? I think it could. How can we prevent this? Inclusiveness is the key. If it were not truly assured or realized, we may not continue to promote economic integration and trade liberalization. I would like to conclude my remarks by suggesting two courses of action. First, support everyone whose livelihood is at risk and ensure a place for them in the new economy. Second, provide business opportunities to all companies, such as CSIS-JETRO is doing for Japan. Today, we have the honor of welcoming accomplished scholars here from Vietnam, China, and Japan. They will share their valuable insights in the following discussion. Thank you very much. My final additional message is talk to JETRO first.
Thank you, Ishige-san. You gave us our homework, but we're going to include the audience in answering it, as I'll explain in a moment. We have been holding this conference between CSIS and JETRO for 12 years now, and the purpose from the beginning has been to bring experts from Japan and from Asia more broadly, and from the U.S. to take stock of the pace and dynamics and direction of Asian integration. We have tended to focus in particular on trade agreements and making sense of the alphabet soup over the last decade of TPP and RCEP and AES and the rest. And we've also tried to look at it in the context of the geopolitical implications and the implications for growth and for politics in all these countries. We increasingly are trying to get all of us a handle on the second question Ishige-san asked, which is how do you create inclusive trade, meaning inclusive of parts of society and the economies in the U.S. or other countries that have not benefited from globalization and are in many cases skeptical of trade. And we'll address that today as best we can, I think in particular in the last panel, which I'll introduce in a moment. And also increasingly when we talk about regional integration and architecture and the economic and geopolitical implications, we can't ignore the huge infrastructure and plans and ambitions that China has articulated. So today we're also going to spend some time on One Belt, One Road, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, two major initiatives launched by China in recent years to expand infrastructure and integration through connectivity. Of course, Japan has a major plan as well. So that'll be a feature this year in a way it hasn't been in the past because it's so important to the regional overall architecture. We're also going to include you, as I mentioned. So this first panel will focus on the developments in the Asia-Pacific region. I'll introduce the panelists in a moment, but we want to try to get on the table a sense of what's happening with all of these negotiations, aspirations, trade agreements that seem to be languishing, and map out what we think is happening. And after a break, we'll come back and I will moderate a discussion based on those presentations with the panel, but also with all of you. So you'll find in front of you or on your table these clickers. They won't work during the first panel. You can't turn off, our presentations or anything like that. But after the break, you'll have an opportunity to use these clickers with 5 buttons to answer multiple choice questions, not trivia questions, but analytical questions or predictions about what people in the audience think is happening or is going to happen with some of the economic infrastructure, trade, negotiating developments in the region. And then at lunchtime, we're going to have a business perspective, and Matt Goodman will moderate. We have Scott Miller, longtime veteran of Procter & Gamble, now at CSIS, and Temi Overby. Senior Vice President for Asia at the Chamber of Commerce. And I'm hoping that may be the panel, Matt, where some of the inclusivity in particular is addressed. So that's the plan. We hope you'll participate. There are surveys from JETRO on how we're doing. Feel free to check, Hyukten Munten perfect scores right now before we start if you like. But there'll be some breaks and a lunch break if you fill those out. I know our colleagues at JETRO would appreciate it. So for the first panel to start mapping out what we up here think is happening in the region, building on Ishige-san's very clear presentation, we have 4 experts. And speaking in order, they will be first Ke Long, the senior fellow and distinguished economic expert and China expert at the Fujitsu Research Institute in Japan. He has received his advanced degrees at the University of Shizuoka and Nagoya, originally from China, and focuses on Chinese economy and U.S.-China economic relations. And then Akio Takahara-sensei, leading scholar on China, professor of contemporary Chinese politics at the Graduate School of Law and Politics at the University of Tokyo, DPhil from the University of Sussex. He plays a leading role now in a number of bilateral commissions between the U.S. and China, trying to understand how to build a framework for more positive relations. Returning for the third time, if not fourth time, I think third time, a veteran now of this conference in CSIS, Vo Tri Thanh. He's was vice president of the Central Institute for Economic Management in Vietnam. He researches trade, liberalization, reform, and is deeply involved in the Vietnamese government's planning and strategy for TPP, RCEP, and other economic and trade negotiations with the region. And finally, last but not least, Matt Goodman, Senior Advisor for Asian Economics and the Simon Chair in Political Economy. He's worked in Republican and Democratic administrations in the White House and State Department on APEC and trade. One of his most important accomplishments was getting the APEC travel card on the agenda, and I was, as someone who benefits from that, as many here do, I was delighted to hear Congressman Larson say they're going to make that permanent, because it really is one of the many ways that APEC has helped facilitate more business and economic exchange. Matt's also been in the private sector with Goldman Sachs and the Stonebridge Group. So I'm going to turn first. We'll go down in this order. Matt's going to wrap up with some discussion points from a U.S. perspective and about the presentations. We'll have a little bit of table conversation, take a break, and open it to you, but over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Green. I'm very glad to be invited to participate this seminar and comment on the issue of economic cooperation in East Asia and Pacific region. I just want to try my best to comment briefly, but actually it's difficult for me to ask our Chinese to do something just in time. So, when we argue something about economic cooperation, I think we cannot forget the history. So let me turn back to take a look at economic cooperation and economic integration in East Asia. I think the first period in Asia, who just contribute to the division of labor in East Asia, that is, the main player is Japanese companies, right? They started to invest in East Asia from 1970s and the 1980s. Especially at the end of 1980s, Japanese companies, they invested in ASEAN countries, especially because of the yen appreciated against the dollars. And in 1990s, Japanese companies, they started to invest to in China because the deflation in Japan domestically. So we must remember the role of Japanese investment. But I think in the second period is that from the year 2000, because China access to World Trade Organization, WTO, in the year 2001, and at the same time, Chinese government and China just promised to open the market, including the fruit market, vegetable market, to ASEAN countries. So I found that ASEAN countries just changed the attitude. They, before that, they looked at Japan, but after that, they look at Beijing because they want to import more vegetables and fruits to China. It's a so huge market. And another key point and a turning point is the year 2010, because in 2008 we had Olympic game in Beijing and Shanghai Expo in the year 2010. So in the year 2010, Chinese economy came to be the second biggest economy in the world. So at that time, or from that time, I think Chinese political leaders, they just image or they dream to be the leader, to take a leadership in the world to improve economic integration. So they announced a framework of One Road and Belt, and meanwhile they established AIIB and Silk Fund, something like that. One of the background is that we have so huge amount of foreign reserve that will support such kind of economic integration. So here, my question is, how can is really China can take leadership and initiative to realize Chinese dream? I think the global issue actually is a domestic issue, because such kind of a huge project must be supported by sustainable Chinese economic development. Just now, President Ishige mentioned innovation. We found that actually Chinese enterprises, especially state-owned enterprises, they are not active to do fundamental research and development. Of course, I think Chinese market is an open market. You can, if you go to Beijing and Shanghai, you can find there's a lot of foreign cars, including American car, Japanese car, and German car. And and some other cars, we don't know who made the cars. Maybe somebody copied the car, I don't know. But this is Chinese car market. Why Chinese enterprises, they are not active to do innovation? I think one of the problem is IPR is not protected by the law, by the rule of law in China domestically. So what I want to say is that if China wants to sustain the economic development, China must reform the economic system, political system, and privatize the state-owned enterprises at first. And the second one, I want to emphasize that China need to work together with Japan regionally. This is very important. I think Beijing, they understand the importance of the role of Japan. Actually, last month I went to Beijing. In the same time, there was the summit of One Road, One Belt. Why I went to Beijing? I cannot, participate the summit, but I just did research that Chinese citizens, how they think about the One Road, One Belt program. I found at least 80% of Chinese ordinary people, they don't know what One Road, One Belt is. Of course, they heard One Belt, but when I asked them to explain One Road, One Belt, but they said, I don't know. So I think the accountability about such kind of a huge project must be supported by the citizens, by Chinese people. So the accountability is not enough. Chinese government, I think, need to do more effort to make it clear domestically. And finally, my conclusion here is TPP is okay, RCEP is okay. The problem is not the framework. The problem is what we can do. And just like President Ishige said, that we need to do more effort to realize a win-win game plus some game. Otherwise, it could not, sustainable. Thank you very much.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you very much. I've been only given 7 minutes, and somehow my computer's battery has run out. So let me just dive into my presentation without any jokes. So can we have the first slide? Thank you. The next one. Yes. First of all, I would like to tell you about my understanding of this permanent drive for regional integration that exists all over the world. I think regional integration, the mechanism of it, exists in 2 layers. One layer is the development of networks between enterprises, firms, civil societies, or even individuals like professionals, academics, pop culture fans. Because of the development in communications technologies, as all of us are aware. And through this network of enterprises and so on, there is this increasing flow of things, including goods, money, information, even drugs, viruses, and so on and so forth. So the second layer is the network of frameworks that consists of frameworks that are formed by the states. Nation states form frameworks in order to promote the flow of good things and in order to control the flow of bad things. And it just happens that the development of networks happen most in the geographical neighborhood. And therefore, the frameworks by the states, in order to control or promote the flow of things, become layers in the geographical neighborhood. They become the layer of these frameworks by the states, and therefore, we see the development of these regional frameworks in areas like Europe or East Asia and so on. And these developments of networks and frameworks could develop into communities. That's the basic situation. But then, can we have the next slide, please? Then the problem, of course, is the stumbling blocks, is the obstacles to these developments. And of course, we are all familiar about the national interests and local interests, parochial interests within the states that prevent the development of these regional integration. Don't have to name them, agricultural interests, industrial interests, all these sectoral interests within countries can be the stumbling blocks to regional development. And interestingly, in Northeast Asia, the existence of North Korea is a stumbling block. If not for North Korea, regional integration in Northeast Asia should develop much more quickly. There is an argument even in China today that perhaps the Chinese should promote the unification of the Korean Peninsula, which should promote regional economic integration in the region and which should create true buffer zones for China. And it's important for all of us how this argument should develop within China. And another aspect of international competition that hampers the development of regional integration is important in our part of the world, that's East Asia. In 2005, we formulated something called the East Asian Summit. And when we were doing that, there was an argument between the Chinese on the one hand and the Japanese and the Singaporeans on the other, because for the sake of balancing this outstandingly big country, China, this is the condition that is very different from what they have in Europe. In East Asia, one big difference from Europe is that there is one outstandingly large country in terms of geography and economics, and even on the military aspect too. So the Japanese wanted the Australians and the New Zealanders to join the East Asian Summit. The Singaporeans particularly wanted the Indians to join. The Chinese opposed to this, but eventually all these three countries joined the East Asian Summit. And in 2010, when the Southeast Asian nations were facing this increasing action by the Chinese in the South China Sea, they invited both the United States and Russia to join, which happened in the following year. So this international competition over leadership is another problem that prohibits the promotion of regional integration in our part of the world. Can you have the next slide, please? Right. In this context of regional integration, how should we interpret the Belt and Road Initiative by China? I think the basic important point is we shouldn't be mesmerized by the fantastic grand presentation that comes out of the Chinese. The Chinese are very good at presenting these grand concepts, but we need to look through the rhetoric and grasp the reality, grasp the facts, as it were. Many of the projects that the Chinese claim to be part of the One Belt, One Road initiative existed way before the announcement of the Belt and Road initiative. So there are existing projects and planned projects put together, and overall the Chinese have started to call them the Belt and Road initiative. So to me, the Belt and Road Initiative is a diplomatic genius, as it were, on the part of the Chinese Communist Party. But at the same time, I tend to see it as something that will fade away in the future, just like the great development of the western part of China. That was the concept by Jiang Zemin, Mr. Jiang Zemin in the past. And Mr. Hu Jintao had this idea about the scientific outlook on development, but very few Chinese talk about these concepts anymore. What's important for the Chinese in the Belt and Road Initiative is the actual projects. The basic idea claimed by the Chinese is that Belt and Road would connect the two major economic zones in the world, that is the East Asian Economic Zone on the one hand and the European Economic Zone on the other. And the idea is to connect these two zones by infrastructure development and develop the intermediate regions. That's the basic idea. But the important point is for the Chinese at the moment is actually to implement these construction projects. However, that as many of you would know, the Chinese are increasingly concerned about the bankability of these projects. So I should think that the Chinese will move in a very prudent way about the implementation of the One Belt, One Road initiative. So now that they have talked so big, the question for China, the problem for China is how they are able to deliver. And increasingly, the Chinese economic situation is going to be tight. It's all right this year with the Party Congress and with the increase in domestic demand through public investment and so on and so forth. But we all know that the long-term trend is for the economic growth rate of China to go down. And in that context, people can get disappointed if the Chinese do not implement so many projects as they have claimed. Can you go to the next slide, please? Yes, in this context, what is the role of the United States? That's the big question that, yes, Mr. Ishige has already, and Mr. Larson also has talked very eloquently about what the United States should be doing. I'm only going to echo what they've said. I tend to think that the United States needs to increase its presence, without which it will be very difficult for Americans to secure the interests in East Asia from now on, particularly when we consider how the Chinese see their national goal, how they would like the regional order to be. It would be difficult for the Americans if you did not maintain and increase your presence to secure your interests there. And secondly, I only have 30 more seconds. The second point quickly is I would like to see more collaboration with Japan in development in the region, socio-economic development. That is what the regional leaders want, including the new Filipino president, Mr. Duterte. And we need to meet the demands there. And if we cooperate well, we can do that. And finally, as Mr. Larson emphasized, we would like the United States to be the guardian of the rules-based order that we have enjoyed in the past decades in the region. And my final point is, in order to do all these things, I think the best way for the United States is to come back to TPP. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sensei. Mr. Vo?
Thank you very much. I would like to thank CSIS and JETRO again for invitation. Within 5 or 6 minutes, I just pick up 2 points. One is evolution of the regional integration over the last 20 years, 30 years, and what's the challenges, what's the issues we are facing now. And the second point, how we can move forward, what kind of regional integration we would like to see. Some people talk about a smarter regional, smarter integration, and that's point at the focus of a lot of debate, discussion at the APEC meetings in March and in May in Hanoi and in Vietnam, right? So the first point, if you look at the regional integration over the last few decades, there are 2 tracks of evolution. One is very much rely on the ASEAN centrality, right? The so-called centric approach integration. We have AEC, ASEAN Economic Community, we have ASEAN Plus 1 FTAs, and now ASEAN Plus 6 RCEP under negotiation. The second track very much driven by US, rule-based, high standard, high quality FTAs. Some people talk about 21st century FTAs. And now we look there, also the FTA-AP, FTAP, even there is a differences between RCEP and TPP, One is more, about liberalization and cooperation. One is more rule-based FTAs. But we think about very much important stepstone for the to have FTAP, FTA-AP at the end of the day. And the leader would like to see, high quality, win-win game for the FTA-AP. And over the last 5 or 7 years, we talk more about connectivity. We understand the importance of facilitation and connectivity infrastructure development. But together with OBOR, don't forget, we have many other initiatives in the region. We have the MPAC, Master Plan for ASEAN Connectivity, approved by the ASEAN leader the year 2010, 7 years ago in Hanoi. And later on, we have the so-called APEC ACB, also, roadmap for the APEC connectivity, approved, I think, in Bali, 2013. And later on, OBOR. And 1 year after, also Japan fund initiative to develop infrastructure, basically within the ASEAN region, focus more high quality infrastructure. So That's the whole thing we have so far. Next, please. So the key aspect dimension of the kind of arrangement in the region, we have the four. One is liberalization on and behind the border issues, dealing with. The second one is a new trade issues, e-commerce, data transaction, labor standard, environmental standard, like under the TPP. The third one is connectivity. We have physical infrastructure development, institution to institution connectivity, and people-to-people connectivity. And last but not least, cooperation also. The key dimension for any kind of arrangement in the region, capacity building, SME development, best practice sharing, and APEC can be an incubator for the new ideas, new initiative for integration. So next, please. But we now facing many challenges. Next, please. One is many already mentioned about political will and leadership, whether you look at the AEC, ASEAN integration, RCEP, and now TPP, and even FTAAP. And we also recognize the security problem in the region, Northeast Asia, Southeast China. In Vietnam, we don't like to use South China Sea. We say East Sea, right? Not South China Sea, East Sea issue. So the way dealing with that also very, critical one. And the role of China, US, Japan, and some other power also very, very essential. Another one is benefit income distribution of the whole process of integration. We understand at aggregate level you can have win-win there, but at micro level and the share of the cake may be unequal. So the gap continue to be increasing, development gap within or between countries. And now people talk about the impact of the technology, IT revolution, the fourth revolution, we don't know yet the impact, cost and benefit on services, employment, on the thing. And last but not least, many ASEAN countries and many countries in the region concerned about how we can overcome middle income trap. Easy to involve engage in production network, global value chain, but not easy to move up the value chain to have higher value added. Next, please. So we think we need to have a new paradigm for smarter integration. Even globalization inevitable, because it's driven by market forces and technology. Number one, liberalization is the key. Be high on the border and new trade issues we have to take into account. That's about efficiency. That's about the opportunities. But that's not enough. We need facilitation, connectivity, how we can access to the opportunity with the lower cost, with the lower transaction cost. So connectivity, facilitation, that's very, very important. And the third one, cooperation, you have opportunity, you can accept that, but you don't have a capability to exploit the new opportunity. So the problem, capacity building, not just people capacity building, but also institutional capacity building. And last but not least, a regional, institution. We need a kind of regional public goods, right? So that's the whole thing. If you would like to see prosperity, development gap reduction, and inclusive, kind of integration and development. Next, please. So I think ASEAN paradigm, AEC, can be good reference for looking at, ASEAN objective is not just prosperity. That's about how we can reduce the development gap. And ASEAN very much based on three big C, community, liberalization, community with the big C, cooperation, and connectivity. Some people talk about the fourth C, there's a centrality. But now ASEAN also emphasize more on innovation, inclusiveness, sustainability, right? So that's a kind of paradigm. But ASEAN also criticized by weak, institution, weak enforcement, like NATO talk only no action. But experience of ASEAN, I think that's very good for looking at, when you try to develop a new paradigm for regional integration. So I stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was very helpful. I should mention that we will post the PowerPoint presentations on the CSIS website, I think on the Simon Chair and Japan Chair. We also have a lot of viewers who are watching us now via podcast, and so don't worry, this will be something you can download. And I'm pretty certain, correct me if I'm wrong, Will, this whole conference will be viewable shortly after we're done. Right. Matthew, what does it all mean?
In 7 minutes. Thanks, Mike, and thank you, Ishige-san and JETRO, for making this conference possible again. We really enjoy this conversation. I always learn something every year, and already have learned things this morning. In fact, all three of those presentations were not exactly what I expected. I think I was expecting more of a presentation of the kind of alphabet soup of different initiatives and which one's winning and which one's losing. But I'm actually glad we didn't do that in a sort of laundry list fashion, because it's maybe not quite so interesting. I think the insights that each speaker gave brought out a dimension of this broader story that I think is quite interesting. And I think I want to focus in particular this year, today, on the connectivity story and in particular the infrastructure of One Belt, One Road and related initiatives, because that's something we've been focused a lot on at CSIS, in particular in the Simon Chair over the past year. But let me bracket that with a few thoughts on the trade alphabet soup, and at the end with something about U.S.-Japan cooperation, sort of picking up on Takahata Sensei's point. So first on the trade, I mean, I just want to remind people that of the analysis, the best analysis, I think, of the economics of these Asian economic integration initiatives, at least here in the United States, which was done by Peter Petrie and others at for the Peterson Institute. They first did this at the end of 2012, and they looked at TPP, and they looked at the RCEP, or the Asian only deal that I think when they started was not yet called RCEP, or at least it wasn't. That wasn't the focus of the analysis. And they did an econometric study, and they found that the gains. This was back in 2012, 2013. That by the year, I think in that first analysis, it was by the year 2025. That the annual income gains to the world, so this is not just to the members of these agreements, but the whole world, the annual income gains from a successful TPP agreement would be on the order of $300 billion per year. And the annual income gains for a successful RCEP agreement would be on the order of $500 billion. And if these two initiatives ended up becoming a free trade area of the Asia Pacific, or some broader, whether it was called that or not, some broader agreement that incorporated all the elements of market opening and rulemaking in those two agreements, then the annual income gains would be almost $2 trillion. That's trillion with a T, in annual income gains. Now, those numbers may have been off by, I'll even say, by half. Okay, $1 trillion per year is still a lot of money, even in my business. So I just want to remind people of how much is at stake here potentially, and how far we are from achieving those numbers, because it looks like TPP is not moving very far, very fast, and RCEP. Although I hear different things when I ask Asian friends about whether this is actually something is going to be signed at the end of this year. It doesn't feel like anything at least meaningful is going to be signed this year. Maybe a piece of paper will be signed because of the 50th anniversary of ASEAN but I doubt that it will be something that's very significant in economic terms. And so I think we're not moving forward on at least those initiatives as a sort of government-led set of trade integration efforts. And so, that's disappointing, and we're losing a lot of opportunity there. Just two other points on trade. One is just as backdrop points. I think it's important to think about the growth story in Asia, and I think at least one or two speakers touched on this, about the fact that there's a lot of uncertainty about the growth trajectory in the Asia Pacific. On the one hand, the IMF has been slightly tweaking up its estimate of global growth, including in Asia and the Asia Pacific region. And all the players are doing a little bit better, but there's a lot of uncertainty. In fact, they talk about the risks being significantly on the downside because of debt questions, because of low productivity growth, because of inequality. So I think that, and the need for structural reform in all countries. So I think there's a lot of uncertainty about the growth trajectory, and that's going to be absolutely vital. Here's my Treasury side talking. We need to think about what kind of growth picture we're going to have in order to assess how much trade integration we're going to have. The other point is the gap between policy and rhetoric right now. It feels like on the one hand, China, for example, as Ishige-san said, is making the case that it's the champion of globalization, but the reality is China is moving in a more mercantilist direction in its policies, and we can elaborate on that maybe in the discussion. On the other hand, the U.S. has been making a lot of noise about trade protectionism in a new direction, but hasn't done a whole lot other than walk away from TPP, which was pretty significant on this front. But there may be things coming very soon. So the gap between policy and rhetoric may be closing even this week if we have some kind of action on the 232 national security things. So bottom line on trade is I think there's a lot of uncertainty. There's not much immediate progress. The U.S. is a real challenge because it's a problem for us. It's a problem for the region that we are not, at the moment, interested in high standard or any kind of integration efforts. But I think our interest is in, the long term, is in being back in the game of high standard rulemaking and market opening in the Asia Pacific region, and I expect at some point we will be back, although I won't predict when. So that's all I want to say about trade. On infrastructure, so I'd say a few things. First of all, there's no question that there is a huge infrastructure need in the Asia-Pacific region. So the ADB, the Asian Development Bank, did a new estimate recently of the need for infrastructure to fill three needs: growth, eliminating poverty, and dealing with climate change. And they come up with an even bigger trillion-dollar number, $26 trillion, $26 trillion by the year 2030 would be needed in theoretically to solve all those problems. So there's a big need. That's I think a reality. Secondly, there's a big push to build infrastructure. There's what I'm sort of probably a little casually calling a new great game going on in the Asia Pacific. It's not just China, Japan, India, Russia, Turkey, Iran are playing in this game. We are, and Will, maybe if you can put up our slide, here's my little bit of advertising here. CSIS, if you weren't aware, is following this competitive game in infrastructure connectivity and infrastructure construction through our project called Reconnecting Asia. And if you go to the site reconnectingasia.csis.org, you will find this map, and on this map behind this map, there's a database of about 1,800 hard infrastructure projects, roads, rails, ports for now, although we intend to add energy pipelines, power grids, and ICT infrastructure and other forms of connectivity infrastructure. About a third of the projects are mapped here. We only put them on our map if we're confident about the geotagging of where the project is actually going to run. And then we have associated analysis with this project. And what we're learning is a few things. First of all, we're trying to understand why this is happening. And I'd say there's a spectrum of reasons, from pure commercial gain through shaping the broader economic infrastructure or economic patterns of trade and activity to to political and geopolitical, geostrategic objectives. And I think everybody has some mix of those objectives in doing this, and we can, again, break that down and talk about. I think we're finding that this business is actually very difficult, very challenging. And so how much of this is actually going to be built? There have been some heroic numbers about, well, I said the ADB number, you have the the numbers that have been announced by China and Japan, which are, again, in the hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars. But this business of infrastructure investment is really hard. It's hard in the United States. If you were in Boston during the big dig, or you ride the metro here in Washington, you know how difficult it is to build and maintain infrastructure. It always is over cost, over time, and quite challenging. And if you look at this geography and think about geography, how difficult it is to build things across this terrain and with this climate condition. And then you think about the human aspects of this region, legal matters, land rights, think about politics, think about security, and you realize this is actually a really hard business, and it's really quite a big question how much of this is going to actually get built. And so I think that's something we need a little reality check on that. Some things are being built, clearly. I've been to some of them and seen them, and they're real. But I think the question is, will they be built? And what effect will they have? How will they be built? What kind of quality will be applied? And this doesn't mean everything has to be, a Lexus. There's a space for a Corolla in this business. You can build, slow-speed trains before you build high-speed trains, and that may be appropriate in some areas. But there are a lot of questions around how this is going to be done. What sort of social, environmental safeguards are there going to be around this infrastructure? Is procurement going to be open or not? What kind of debt implications are there for the borrowing countries? Because in most cases, including in China's case, they're not doing this as charity. They want a return on their investment. And so that has implications for debt. So lots more to say about infrastructure, but I just want to say that I think this is something that we're very focused on, and we're trying to get to the bottom of what's really happening, why it's happening, what its implications are, particularly economically for the region in the spirit of this conference. And happy to talk more about that. Final point, just on U.S.-Japan economic cooperation. So, when I, with Mike, was an intern at USTR almost 30 years ago. No, it was 30 years ago, scarily enough. We had a different relationship. The U.S. and Japan were in a very tense economic and trade relationship. And, the progress from that time to the signing of TPP is absolutely, extraordinary. And I think we need to remember how far we've come in our economic cooperation over that time. Now we don't have TPP as the organizing principle as it had been for the previous 5 years until President Trump, decided to walk away from TPP. And so we have to have something else to be the organizing principle. And there are lots of things in principle that we could do, from negotiating a bilateral FTA, which I have some skepticism about both its merits and its feasibility or likelihood, and we can talk about that. But there may be other arrangements that we could come to bilaterally that are short of that would be useful to both of us, including in keeping the U.S. engaged in high standard rulemaking and keeping a door open to the U.S. returning to TPP. But meanwhile, in third countries, and this is picking up on Takahara-san's point finally, I think there's a huge scope for the U.S. and Japan to be working in third countries, particularly in the Asia-Pacific region, on a long, in fact, I have here a sort of laundry list of things that we could be working on, from the digital economy to state-owned enterprise governance to energy security, anti-corruption, financial integration, tax evasion, infrastructure, as I've talked about, public health issues, agriculture development, space. I mean, there are a lot of things on which the U.S. and Japan have a lot of real strengths and capacities that we can bring to the table, that not all of which, most of which, don't involve large amounts of money, but require instead our technology, our capacity that we bring, and if we apply it strategically. And I think that's the challenge for the two countries. And I think if we do that, that will enrich our our own peoples, but also make the story of growth and integration in the Asia-Pacific much stronger. And so that's what I'm hoping for, looking for, and certainly we're going to be talking about specific ways of working together on those issues. So thank you, and look forward to the discussion.
So when Matt and I were interns in junior high school 30 years ago, in public opinion polls that Chicago Council on Foreign Relations began doing in 1987 or 8 or so, Japan was ranked as the least trustworthy trade partner the United States had in the world. A few years ago, Japan ended up the most trusted trade partner the United States has anywhere in the world, with whom we do not currently have a free trade agreement. And I just want to say that's because of the work Matt and I did as interns. And under Mr. Lighthizer, who's back, so, you know. We're going to take a break. I want to ask one meta question. Then we'll have coffee and come back and do the clickers, and you can ask questions of the panel. Congressman Larson, before that, President Obama, many people have said if we don't actively lead on initiatives like TPP and so forth, then China will write the rules in Asia. So it's a good line because clearly there are consequences if the U.S. steps back. But to set up our discussion after the break, I wonder, beginning with Matt, if you could briefly say, what does that mean? China will write the rules. Does it mean China will, enable low-quality FTAs and block reform and integration, so more, low-quality defensive things? Do you think actually China will begin writing new rules, new standards that exclude the U.S., or is it more geopolitical? China will start using a more privileged position to, be more assertive in the South China Sea? Or, what does it mean? If you can briefly, we'll come back to it later, briefly, starting with Matt, tell us, what does that mean? Or do you not accept the premise?
I was going to say yes to all the things that you said. I mean, I think it's a bit harsh on the ears to say, if we don't write the rules, China will write the rules. But I think there is a truth in it, in the sense that if you break down some of the issues that I mentioned in that list of things the U.S. and Japan could work on, start with the digital economy. Do the U.S. and Japan and Vietnam, for that matter, prefer to have an internet that is open and allows, pretty much, anything to happen with, appropriate security controls, or does it want one that is sort of subject to individual countries' sort of what's called internet sovereignty, where each country can kind of, parse up and decide how to allocate space in the internet, as it were? Do we want data to flow freely across borders, or do we want to have countries be required to keep their data stored in a particular geographic location? Because if we want the former, we want U.S. and Japan to be working on high standard rules. If we want the latter, then we should let China determine these things. But that's just one of many examples where there are things at stake, and I think we need to be in this game, or I do think we, as roads get built, telecom infrastructure gets built alongside, standards get set that I think could hurt us commercially and possibly geopolitically.
Mr. Vo, from your perspective, Vietnam, ASEAN, is China going to start writing rules?
Three things when we think about China in a global context. One is China now become a global power in terms of economics, right? Whatever you like, you don't like. There's opportunity, there's challenges. The second point, but China is not up to the point. China can set the rules for the games, right? Of course, that's very hard to make the game without the agreement by China. But China not yet up to the point. China can set the rules. One example, there's TPP. I don't think China have a big problem to meet the criteria for the SOEs under the TPP. But for the e-commerce data transaction, as maybe China like to talk about internet economy rather than just a digital economy, right? In that sense, the third point is that China understand that. So China don't try to be hurry in many things, right? If you look at the AIIB, for example, China try to ensure that AIIB will function in compliance with the best international standard, not the Chinese standard, right? Or you look at the other thing like RCEP, right? So look at the high quality in some dimension that they may be referred to TPP or whatever. So following up, not the new rules of game. So that's a very dynamic development. So whatever the case, we think U.S., China and Japan and some other like Korea, Australia, and even India can play the role in the process.
I suppose it's not only rule writing, but implementation, enforcement. That is very important. Yes, I do agree that AIIB has been a good learning process in a way. But that's because the Chinese know that if they did not do things according to international rules, then the rating of the bank would be low and the fundraising cost would be very high. So there's a condition under which they do follow the rules. So what we are concerned about is how the Chinese in recent years have been using economic sanctions as a means to impose their political will. Look at what they're doing to South Korea nowadays. So that's the concern. But I do agree with Mr. Kerlon that there is also a big potential for China and the neighboring nations to cooperate. So we hope that China will, learn better, or we can create a condition under which China would be following the rules and be implementing the rules with us.
Well, no doubt to create a free, fair, global, transparent market and institution is very important. But I think that China is still in the process to learn how to dialogue with the global community, how to deal with the global community. But unfortunately, before that, Chinese economy has been come to be so huge, the second biggest economy in the world. So Chinese political leaders, they just want to take a leadership in a global community, but they need time to learn how to deal with the global community. Especially, I think they want to work together with Japan to create, for example, something like FTA or EPA, something like that. And also, there's so many foreign direct investment from United States and Japan and European countries in China. So how to realize a win-win game in China, I think I still want to emphasize it's not only a global issue, it is a domestic issue, I think.
Thank you. I think it was important to get that on the table as we talk about the consequences of ceding the field. The ultimate goal, as several of you said in your presentations, is wealth creation and geopolitical transparency and stability by merging all of these efforts into one trans-Pacific and eventually global set of rules. But I'm glad you all, or several of you, highlighted that this is not just about who writes the rules about infrastructure in Asia. This is going to be profoundly about the debate within China about its own economy and its economy's role with the world. So it's important, and that was helpful. So we're going to take a break. There's coffee in the back. You'll hear bells when it's time to come back in. Come back in, prepare your clickers, and we'll hear from you. Thank you all very much. Okay, thank you. Welcome back. We're now going to move to the clicker section of the program and also Q&A for the panel. We have about 5 or 6 questions which we will use to briefly discuss the topics in the question, but then we'll open it up if we have time for questions directly to the panel. So if you have your clicker, the most important thing is to hit the on button, and then a green light comes on. So please hit the on button. Please don't aim it at us. Actually, you can aim it anywhere you like, and it will pick it up. And you'll see A, B, C, D, E. You can click as often as you want, but you only get 1 vote. Yeah, you're only going to get 1 vote, except for me and Matt. We get 24 votes. So we're going to put up some questions to try to test the audience's sense of the dynamics in economic integration and all of these initiatives we've been talking about, and then we'll sort of get some reaction from the panel.
It's anonymous, so you won't.
Oh,
Nobody will know your vote.
It's anonymous. We don't have a, logarithm in the computer where we can find out who you are, or zap you through the clicker if you get the answer wrong. It's completely anonymous. It's just going to aggregate how many people voted for each option. We've had a lot of success with these in terms of generating interesting questions. We also were once démarched by the U.S. government, by USTR in the previous administration, because the clicker result came out with the answer that wasn't U.S. policy. So we'll see if we can do that again too. All right, the first question, Will, if you could put it up to get us started. I'll read it, but you can click whenever you're ready. Which of the following initiatives related to economic integration in the Asia-Pacific region has the greatest momentum now? We're going to ask about long-term in a minute, but right now, which one? TPP 11, which is the original TPP members minus the U.S., Japan largely in the lead. RCEP, which you've heard about, which is the 10 ASEAN countries, Japan, Korea, China, Australia, New Zealand, India. The ASEAN Economic Community, the 10 ASEAN members, or China's One Belt, One Road, or none of these. So I'm going to click 2. Okay, we'll stop this in a minute because some people just keep changing their mind, and we could go on. We could go on forever. Okay, Will, freeze it. Can we do that? Yeah, good. Where are you? Okay, thank you. All right, so panel, TPP 11, 20%. RCEP only 7%. I find that surprising because in terms of actual negotiations, right now RCEP's sort of the only thing happening up there. ASEAN Economic Community, 16 people, 18%, perhaps because it's more limited geographically, and OBOR, weeks after the giant conference, wins with 44%, but pretty distributed. So I'm going to call on Mr. Vo because Vietnam is the only one in all of these. So what's your reaction?
Not surprising. I think, given the fact that behind the TPP now, even TPP minus, or we talk about TPP 11 and OBOR, there's China, US, and other powers, right? So when the people vote for the TPP 11 and or TPP minus and OBOR, that's not just they think about economic, kind of development, but also the role of the powers, the leadership behind that process, right? So I think that's quite consistent with the way people in the region now think of.
We have asked these questions over the years, and I think, Matt, you may recall about 4 years ago or 5 years ago, RCEP won. That's when we got démarched by USTR. But within a year or two, because of Mike Froman's and the president's active negotiations, TPP jumped to the head. So these things move up and down. But Matt, why don't you go next? And we'll get everything.
I think this is not that surprising. I think it probably reflects more awareness than it does actually, actually significance about, which one of these is making the most progress. I mean, because of all the press reporting on the Belt and Road Forum, the so-called BARF, the other day in Beijing, it's drawn a lot of attention. I think if you'd asked this question 3 weeks ago, my guess is that purple bar would have been barely mentioned. So there's definitely a lot of attention on this right now. I mean, I think the TPP-11, it's interesting that, again, maybe not surprising in a room like this, that people are focused on this. In general, in Washington, I don't sense that many people, and as Congressman Larson said earlier, are really focused on that. But I think that's quite significant as well, and none of us really talked about that in detail. But if these 11 non-U.S. members of TPP decide to move forward, as Japan is now trying to lead an effort to move it forward and achieve an implemented deal, I mean, that's going to be very difficult for a number of reasons. But if it happens, I think that will be very significant in terms of putting down the kinds of markers on rulemaking that was being sought, by the U.S. When it was pushing this, and maybe keeps the door open to the U.S. coming back eventually.
So the TPP-11 is not correct me if I'm wrong, it's not a formal group yet. It's formal in the sense that there have been meetings of the other TPP members, but one of the key announcements was that TPP-11 is designed to allow countries, unnamed, but obviously the United States, to rejoin, because we're the only country that left. And so it is aimed at sort of resurrecting TPP somehow, perhaps putting pressure on the U.S., but there's not an actual negotiation yet. It's just been meetings, right? Takahara-san?
I just want to add that the One Belt, One Road initiative is a fantastic facade that's being put up by the Chinese party, and it helps enhance the international image of China and the authority of Xi Jinping domestically. And, the Chinese have this propaganda department, and they do such a wonderful job that they've been so successful in putting up this facade. So I commend them for that.
We're going to have a question on OBOR in more detail later, but first, Mr.
Comparing with other options, I do think that the OBOR, One Belt, One Road, is, more, how to say, could be realized, because Chinese government want to take a leadership. But I still want to emphasize that actually Chinese economy is slowing down now, and foreign reserve started to decline. And especially this year is a political season in Beijing. So for China, there's a lot of homework to do. But TPP 11, for example, this so weak leadership is the problem. So how to Japan, for Japan, how to persuade United States come back to TPP, I think this is a very interesting point.
Did the panel vote?
Yes.
Okay, so who did you vote for? Go down the line. Who did you put as number one, Matt?
Yeah, I put OBOR. But can I just say, in this respect, there are only 88 total numbers up there, and there are more than 88 people in this room, so there are people who are shy. Please play the game. It's not, there's no pain, there's no harm in doing it. Make sure you turn it on. I think that might be another problem. Push the orange button.
E.
None of the above.
Yes.
Is that because is that because we forgot one, or the horse race doesn't matter?
No, I'm a little negative about the framework, right? All of the framework, I'm negative.
The overall economic
Yes,
framework.
yes.
So you don't think that any of these are significant enough to merit
I think bilateral FTA could be more easy.
U.S.-Japan?
Yes.
Interesting. We'll come back to that. Very interesting. All right, so there's a bit of a flash in the pan, maybe a bit of PR success, or maybe not, with the recent BARF conference over One Belt One Road. Let's do the next question, which asks 10 years from now. So that's, you know, the Dwayne Johnson administration, or wherever we are in U.S. politics. That was not an endorsement. So 10 years from now, once we get out of the current sort of peculiar political and international environment, when things settle down perhaps, which of these same initiatives will be the most significant in terms of defining Asian economic integration? Are more people voting, Matt? Can you tell? Will, is there any technical advice? Should they hold their flippers up or aim at the... Just push. Okay. All right. So in the long run... Sorry? Yes. In other words, most significant because it fails is not the premise. Most likely to succeed and therefore shape regional integration. So that's a pretty, you know, it's a Washington audience, but it's an international audience with a lot of jaded, skeptical journalists and analysts in the room, and that's a pretty optimistic view in the long run about TPP. Interesting. So I'm not going to call on you on this one, but maybe you could start us, Takahara-san, on whether this optimism is merited.
Well, I suppose when we think about the flow of history, as it were, TPP seems to be the direction in which we should be moving, as I tried to explain in my presentation. And once again, OBOR is really not about integration of Asia. You know, it does talk about trying to integrate Europe and Asia, but the Chinese themselves know the difficulty in creating the infrastructure to connect the two zones. So it's going to take a very, very long time before you know, these two areas are successfully connected by the infrastructure that people envisage.
Others like to comment? And is your optimism based on an assessment of the nature of trade and investment, production networks, and sort of the necessity or the demand that there will be to create this kind of Trans-Pacific framework?
No, I think that's why I voted for it, because I think, I mean, for two reasons. One, because I think it's in the U.S. national interest, and you can change, you know, a government, you can change a leader, you can change a policy, but it's really hard to change a national interest. And you know, I think the national interest of the United States is to be leading high standard rulemaking like TPP, whether it's called that or not. And I think within 10 years we'll be back in that game. I'm sure Dwayne Johnson, The Rock, is going to appreciate all of that. And then on the other side, on the demand side, I agree. Look at the fact that Vietnam wanted to be part of this thing. I mean, who would have predicted 10 years ago that Vietnam would have wanted to enthusiastically move forward with an initiative like this? It's because they want to be part of those supply chain networks. They want the next dollar of investment from the U.S. or Japan or China to come to Vietnam, not to Indonesia or Thailand or somewhere else. And that means they've got to do the reforms and the rules that have been imposed, you know, that are in TPP. So, and of course, they want access to the U.S. market. So, I think. You know, those are why I think it's still a compelling case.
So in the current situation we're in, where there's so much uncertainty, a lot of people would argue, I would argue, that Vietnam is kind of the pivotal player. Because I think we'll come back to you, but I think U.S.-Japan integration is going to happen somehow. But the key more broadly is, what choice does Vietnam make while TPP is in a little bit of limbo? And if Mr. Vo, if Vietnamese leaders and public and business leaders think that TPP in the long run is going to be the preeminent or defining institution, that's a good thing. But do you think people in Hanoi would look at it this way? Or do you look at it this way?
Very hard question. I am not a member, Politburo member, to answer the question. But I think whatever the case, we think TPP is very important, right? Whatever the case, for three reasons. TPP is not just about cost and benefit, you know, like assessed by Petri. You mentioned, huge benefit can bring TPP by TPP. But TPP is about two other things. One is a TPP we see as a template, kind of paradigm. Even not perfect one, but you need to look at whatever you try to have new arrangement or trade arrangement, whatever the case. For example, in the case of Vietnam, TPP is a template for Vietnam to negotiate with the EU. So within 2.5 years, we finalize the negotiation with the EU for the Vietnam-EU FTAs, right? That's a good template. And right now, RCEP or AEC also look at the TPP, which kind of aspect we can take into account for the AEC or RCEP if you would like to have higher quality for better resource allocation in terms of efficiency improvement. And last, I think TPP important because there's catalyst for the domestic reform, right? Because of TPP, basically, there's about new issues and behind the border. So even I know China, Thailand also very carefully study the TPP so they can have a kind of reform in consistent way with the, how we open up your economy. So TPP is important in that sense. TPP is also better right now in terms of promoting production network. If you look at the rule of origin but in TPP, there's a fully accumulated rule of origin. You can take into account the value added in the process within your country, input from that one. If you look at other ASEAN or ASEAN plus one, there's a very simply accumulated rule of origin and quasi accumulated. So in that sense, TPP also is a good one. RCEP, problem with RCEP is three. One is we would like to see higher quality of RCEP, but different countries, they have different ambitions, right? Yeah. That one. So without the higher quality of the RCEP lose the meanings in the significance because we already have ASEAN plus one FTAs, right? Another problem with RCEP is we try to have 16 FTA for 16 countries, right? But right now we have ASEAN plus one FTA, but we don't have CCK FTAs, China, Korea, Japan FTA. So that's also a problem. And last but not least, there's a leadership for the RCEP. RCEP is, begin with initiative by the ASEAN leader. But now, many talk about the role of China, Japan, India, on the other countries. So how to balance between the role of ASEAN and, the role of China, Japan, and India, that's also the big problem for RCEP. So that's why the negotiation process is very, very slow, very slow. For the TPP, we think side by side with the APEC summit in November in Da Nang in Vietnam, the leader will finalize the scenario for the TPP. And now the minister asked the expert to try to look at on the scenario for TPP, right? And I am quite optimistic about that one. I think in November, we can have the final answer for whether we have a TPP 11, TPP minus, whatever.
So you make an excellent point about, in a way, OBOR and TPP or RCEP being apples and oranges, because TPP in particular is facilitating and creating rules for production networks, and OBOR is infrastructure. But I bet if we did this same survey, if we had a comparable audience in, for example, Berlin right now, I bet you that the audience would say OBOR, because it's big in Europe, and obviously in places in between, well, Thailand or Kazakhstan and so forth. So let's go back to OBR briefly and do one more question about One Belt, One Road. I recognize these options are not mutually exclusive, but to try to tease out what OBOR means, you have 4 options. It is creating a Sino-centric economic architecture that will transform Asia's security dynamics. B, it's competing head-to-head with the Trans-Pacific economic frameworks. Not mutually exclusive, we know. C, it's a waste of Chinese money on ill-considered projects. Or D, it's likely to pave the way for further integration of infrastructure development among China and other leading economies, meaning the US, Korea, Japan, so forth, that it's not necessarily going to be exclusive. You cannot click. Oh, I guess E, Will, can we make E none of the above? Okay, E is none of the above. So, over a third of the audience, if they can make up their mind, over a third of the audience thinks that that OBOR is going to transform Asia's security dynamics by creating this infrastructure architecture. And just behind that, at a third, is the view that this is largely a waste of Chinese money, the Takahara view. Why don't... That it's a brilliant PR message. So, Matt, we'll start with you because of your Reconnecting Asia project.
Yeah, I mean, this is a tough one because it is sort of nuanced here. I mean, it's in a way, it's kind of all of those things, I guess. It's going to change some patterns of trade. It's going to make some of those patterns more Sino-centric. A lot of money is going to be wasted because some of these projects don't make sense or aren't going to be sustainable for one or another reason. It is competing, I think, to some extent with a Trans-Pacific. I mean, when you hear Trans-Pacific, that's sort of the American view because we're a Pacific power but not an Asian one. And so I think to some extent there's a bit of competition, although that one's probably, I think, a little overstated because they're not really, I mean, propaganda or PR-wise, China may have been responding to in the moment to the failure of TPP by pushing up ramping up the OBOR stuff. But I don't think they're really the same thing. I mean, they're not directly in competition, but there's some element of that sort of geopolitical competition. So it's sort of all of the above to me.
Mr. Kate, I think you said you were in China and asked people about OBOR. What do you think?
Well, I think OBOR is more inclusive and more open than TPP, for example. But the problem is here is the rule of law and the governance about the OBOR. So if TPP can be redesigned more inclusive and more open, then China could commit to TPP, and also Japan and the United States, I think, could join OBOR.
Can I just very quickly re-emphasize this point that OBOR is different from APEC or RCEP or TPP in the sense that OBOR is not a framework; it's an initiative. So the contour of it is very blurred. It's very unclear, and that's why it's so hard to grasp and understand what OBOR is. It's just a bundle of things. And they nicely put up this facade as OBOR, but it's not a framework.
And in fact, it's getting more amorphous in the sense that they're now adding the Arctic as another part of this. So now it's going to be one belt, one road, one circle, apparently. So it's really everything. I was at a panel the other day, and one of the speakers joked that your lunch was brought to you today by OBOR, or was prepared by OBOR. It's sort of it is very murky and not clear what the geographical or policy or even physical infrastructure boundaries of this are.
So I think the audience was probably wise not to emphasize B, because OBOR and TPP are not competing directly. They're competing indirectly in terms of momentum, credibility, leadership, and could be compatible. And I also think the audience was probably wise to point to C. China has never done this kind of massive external Marshall Plan, if you will, the way the US or Japan have. And they're going to discover all kinds of things about moral hazard, about the perils of trying to take on all these high-risk infrastructures and associated debt on their own. And I suspect it's may push a lot of Chinese leaders and planners towards D, which is we need to do this with others. And so the Japan proposal for infrastructure and the China proposal right now are in open competition in geopolitical terms, but ultimately there's incentive to pool the efforts. And the last point, I'm personally most skeptical about A. I think, and I'm going to turn to you, Matt, on this, but I think the transforming Asia security dynamics, I'm very doubtful that OBOR will fundamentally change the dynamics among the major powers. The US, of course, but also Japan, India, Australia. I would include Vietnam. And in a way, you could call these the maritime powers, and the powers that are most committed to production networks. And where it will have the most geopolitical influence will be in developing states in continental Asia. And the idea to me, Matt, that we're going to suddenly have freight trains from Rotterdam to Shanghai competing with freight at sea, or the Internet of Things, or the Arctic, to me is a little bit far-fetched. It may shorten the transit time, but the amount, it's just not, to me, going to be as significant as the integration, largely on the, starting from the maritime side, that Japan began in, as Mr. Kay said, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And so, yes, it's going to transform some states' relationships with China. It's going to open to competition with Russia and Central Asia. It's going to have, in the sort of continental Asia, some influence, but I have a very hard time picturing it competing to define Asia among the major powers, most of which are maritime powers.
Yeah, I mean, 90% of global commerce now goes by sea, international commerce by sea, and so one of the uber questions we were asking, or are asking in Reconnecting Asia is this, reconnecting of the Silk Roads, going to change that number significantly and bring, more land-based connections from Europe to Asia. And, I share your skepticism, having been about a year ago to a dry port at the border between Kazakhstan and China called Khorgos. It's on our map. You can look it up. I'd never heard of a dry port, but the reason there's a dry port is that the Russians in the imperial era were paranoid about invasion, mostly from Europe, and designed a rail gauge that was wider than the European standard. And so the former Soviet states like Kazakhstan have the wider gauge. China has the narrower gauge. And so you got a problem when you get to the border. You've either got to lift the train and widen the gauge and drop it back down on the track, or, as happens at this dry port, you get these big seaport cranes and you lift the containers and put them on the waiting train, and then you go on your way. And that takes 45 minutes as opposed to 3 to 4 hours. So, and there are efficiencies around that. So I went there, and it was a really good metaphor for this whole story, because it took 5 hours to drive from Almaty to that point. Down a very bumpy road where there's nothing there. I mean, a few, sheep and horses, but really nothing. And so you're struck by the geographic. When you get there, it's, I think, one of the most remote places, the furthest point you can be from salt water almost in the world. So you're really in the middle of nowhere. And you see this thing and you think, wow, that's a shiny new thing. Things are going to happen. But there were no trains when I was there, so the guy said, oh, they'll be here in the afternoon. Well, maybe so, maybe not. When you go back into Kazakhstan from the border area, you have to go through customs and you get shaken down, basically. It takes 3 hours and you get shaken down. So there's a whole bunch of soft infrastructure questions at the border which have to be dealt with. So it just all sort of sums up, yeah, in theory, it's there, it's being built, it in theory could create new patterns of trade, but it's going to be really difficult in practice. So that's why I'm still a little skeptical.
So don't panic.
Don't panic.
Don't assume it's all bad. Don't assume that their U.S., China, Japan might not be able to cooperate on infrastructure development someday. And keep watching Reconnecting Asia on CSIS. Will,
Especially that one.
Will, can we skip to the very last question?
Oops.
So this is a question, and I'm going to start with Mr. Kaye because he's raised a U.S.-Japan bilateral FTA. So, you know, of all the countries in the Pacific and in Asia, probably the one most committed to a trans-Pacific architecture is Japan. You know, Australia would be up there, but Australia already has a bilateral FTA with the U.S., and there's talk now in the administration about a bilateral U.S.-Japan FTA. So this is the question, what should the U.S. and Japan, but really Japan, do over the next few years? A, focus on getting the U.S. back into TPP. B, negotiate a bilateral FTA. C, focus on the irritants bilaterally, pharmaceutical pricing in Japan, issues like that. Or D, focus on economic cooperation with third countries. I'm guessing people voting for D are from third countries. I'm not sure. Okay, getting the U.S. back into TPP. It's not a forlorn hope, but that's a pretty bold. I agree with that, but it's pretty bold. Now, Mr. Kaye, you mentioned earlier bilateral U.S.-Japan FTA. Could you start with your assessment of the question and the response?
I'm sorry. I think this is only the feasible program for us to do.
What is it?
Improve the bilateral FTA negotiation between Japan and China and the United States. And meanwhile, there are so many uncertainties that whether U.S. could come back to TPP. So TPP, how do we redesign more inclusive? I don't know. So I think that the bilateral FTA could be more feasible.
Let's go down the line. Takahara-san, what do you think?
I suppose when the question says which should the U.S. and Japan prioritize, it's those who want the U.S. back into TPP should be doing, right? But it's very difficult, I suppose, for the variety of reasons that we all know. Therefore, I press D.
Okay. And Mr. Vo, some people argue that a U.S.-Japan bilateral FTA would be a really important signal to Vietnam, since that's, you know, some people would argue, easier to achieve than getting, in the U.S., easier to achieve politically than getting back into TPP. But what do you think?
The first one, I would like to see 3 scenarios for Japan. One is continue to lead the TPP minus, or TPP 11. And second, to get the U.S. back to the TPP, and together with that, you can have bilateral FTA with the U.S. In the case of Vietnam, we support the TPP. We value the importance and significance of the TPP, whatever the case. At the same time, we now also, together with the U.S., think about how we can strengthen bilateral relations between the U.S. and Vietnam. We have foundation for that. We have BTA with the U.S. Signed in the year 2000. 4 years later, we have a TIFA already, Trade Investment Framework Agreement, before we joined the TPP. So we have foundation for the bilateral. But whatever the case, I think we need to keep the spirit of the TPP. Because at the end of the day, even we have bilateral or TPP minus, there's easy too much, right? If the U.S. come back to the TPP. So whatever the case. Of course, bilateral FTA is better than nothing, but we, in terms of economics, relation, trade, investment, services flow, I think multilateral is much better, given the production network and global value chain.
Matt, so
I basically have the Takahara view that A is the ideal but unrealistic in the near term, as long as the Trump administration has the view it's in. So I think D is where we should focus our attention while
D is in Delta?
D is in Delta. But B is interesting because, I'm not clear that the Trump administration really wants a bilateral FTA. I mean, I think they want bilateral trade concessions from Japan, so call those maybe bilateral trade deals if you want. But bilateral FTA, at least once they know what a bilateral FTA is, Mr. Lighthizer, I think, does, but I don't think Mr. Ross or Mr. Cohn or Navarro actually know what a trade, or President Trump know what's involved in doing an FTA, and I don't think they're going to like it when they see it, and they're not going to want to have to try to sell it. So I'm skeptical, but I do think, and I think there's some thinking along these lines in Tokyo, that there is value in trying to work on some sort of framework that captures the rule-making part of TPP bilaterally in some form. And I don't know that anybody, I certainly don't know what exactly that form is, but the notion is if we can get the U.S. and Japan, who were really the champions of most of that rule-making stuff, to say they've agreed, to move that stuff forward, it's relatively easy to get agreement on that. It could help with, say, Vietnam's interest in staying engaged, because if they think this means that the U.S. is still kind of in the game and is working with Japan on the rulemaking part, the U.S. may come back. We'll get access to the U.S. market for clothes and shoes and maybe catfish. Sorry, that didn't get resolved, did it, in TPP? But so it keeps the flame alive, as it were, a little bit better if the U.S. and Japan. So there may be some reasons to try to make that happen, but I think an FTA is a bridge too far.
So let me
use an infrastructure.
Let me abuse my position to tell you what I think, because this is my last time up here. From a pragmatic perspective and thinking about the U.S.-Japan security relationship and the need to keep on track for a multilateral trans-Pacific agreement and eventually FTAP, from all those perspectives, I think today, I may change next week, I think today that a bilateral discussion on an FTA, thinking about a model FTA, thinking about the elements, is probably a good idea. That it is not practical to actually initiate an FTA. You have to notify Congress. Our colleague Scott Miller pointed out to us the other day that the notification on NAFTA elicited 12,000 public comments that they have to address. So, and NAFTA is supposed to go first. So I think time is on the side of a careful consideration, discussion of what a model FTA would look like, and perhaps in particular those elements that would align with a successful NAFTA outcome and the TPP-11. But you still have these irritants, and there's probably going to have to be some basket or some framework within the dialogue started between Vice President Pence and Deputy Prime Minister Aso to address these. In my view, you don't want them in the FTA, because there are sectoral issues that are sort of tactical kind of issues, but you can't ignore them. And that's going to be the challenge, I think, in the upcoming stages of the Aso-Pence dialogue. I'm going to take, because I said I would, we'll take one question, or maybe two if you can be brief, and then let the panelists, sorry? Yes, Terry. We have a microphone for you. And if you could keep it brief, we'll try to get one more in and then let the panel respond.
I'll keep it very brief. I'm Terry Murphy. I'm with CSIS, but I'm in no way expert or particularly knowledgeable on this particular subject. But I did hear a comment about the effect of time and slowness, et cetera. And I'm minded of history that our Asian friends might wish to know about. When Secretary Seward, President Lincoln's secretary, purchased Alaska in 1860-something, it was called Seward's Folly. It was an ignorant, stupid thing to do. We got Alaska from the Russians. And President Eisenhower in the 50s built what would now be a big road, and that is the American highway system. It took a long, long, long time. So I think when people speak in terms of time, it's useful to remember some other historical examples that might not have caught the attention of our friends from Asia. Thank you.
That's true. I mean, a lot of what we're talking about is supposed to set the rules for decades, and we should be thinking about the long game. Yes. Here? Yeah, there you go.
Very short. How can you fill the gap between a kind of consensus here and White House?
There is, first of all, there is not a consensus in the White House. That's quite clear. For now, those individuals in the administration or in Congress who support the administration who believe trade and engagement is critical to our economic and national security interests are being fairly quiet because the politics are just not right. So my answer to that question would be those of us who are not in that awkward position should be saying what we think is the right path. I very much like the way Congressman Larson did it. He's a Democrat, but he tried not to jam the president. And he tried to, lay the basis for a bipartisan consensus. And I think with some confidence that we'll get there. So that's all we can do. I don't think the swamp or the blob, which by the way is all of us, is going to turn around this political debate in the near term. But as Matt said, there are national interests, and to Terry Murphy's point, those are measured in decades. And so I think people in this room should be laying out the case, but be realistic, as I think everyone on the panel was, about the politics in the near term. And now I'm going to advertise my book, By More Than Providence, which is a history of U.S. strategy in Asia, including trade and economic strategy that begins in 1783. And if you get all the way through it, you'll see that the seeds of our success in Asia were often planted and nurtured over years and decades, like Seward, like Eisenhower, like Kennan. And we shouldn't be silent about that long-term view. That'd be my answer. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Good comments and questions. We have lunch back there, and then Matt is going to lead a luncheon discussion with Tammy and Scott from the business perspective, and also looking at the inclusive trade question. Thank you all very much.
Please continue chewing, but if you could do that without, as your mother would have said, please don't talk while you're eating. We're going to go on with the program because we have, relatively limited time and some great brain power up here, and I want to take maximum advantage of it. So this session is to give a business perspective on these questions of Asian economic integration and U.S.-Japan cooperation. And we have a terrific pair of folks to help us with this. Tammy Overby, I'm sure everybody in this room knows, Senior Vice President for Asia at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. She's been involved in a lot of the trade agreement battles of the last many years, including when she was in Korea working on the Chorus FTA. And if we have time, I'd like to get to that. But terrific to have you with us, Tammy. Thank you for joining us. And then Scott Miller, my colleague from CSIS, also well known to this audience, the Scholl Chair in International Business, and formerly, as Mike said, with Procter & Gamble for many years, and again, involved in pretty much every trade battle. As I often say, Scott's encyclopedic in his knowledge of trade policy, to the point that he not only knows what the vote count was on TPA in 2002, but what people had for lunch that day before they went to vote. So he's got an amazing, it's almost literally true. It's amazing. Okay, so let me start by asking Tammy a sort of framing question. So why does U.S. business care about the Asia Pacific, and what's going on out there that makes it interesting and makes you get involved?
May I ask your colleague to put up the slides right now? And what's at stake is very simple: everything. This is a slide of what the Asia Pacific U.S. trade with AP looked like in 2000. And the U.S., we are blue. So the U.S. was many people's #1 trade partner in 2000. Sir, can you go to the next slide now? Fast forward to 2015. China is now everyone's #1 trade partner in Asia, with the exception of Canada, Mexico, Chile, and Peru. What a coincidence. We have free trade agreements with those countries. So what's at stake? Again, everything. Right now, there are 147 free trade agreements in force in the Asia-Pacific region, another 70 or 80 under negotiation or in the process of entering into the force, and the U.S. is party to 3. We have an FTA with Singapore, with Australia, and with Korea, the Chorus FTA. The U.S. business community is extremely disappointed that the United States is withdrawn from TPP. TPP to us was the future. It was setting the rules, high standard, comprehensive rules that would force a race to the top, not a race to the bottom. It took over 6 years of negotiations. I burned through a lot of the U.S. Chamber's Asia budget with my staff and I going to those rounds, representing American industry, and ensuring that when the final agreement was completed, over 90% of that text was U.S. proposed text. So America got almost everything we wanted, and then we walked away. However, all is not lost. I really want to thank our Japanese friends because what we see now is Japan's leadership with the TPP-11. So I ran into Tim Grosser the other night. He's New Zealand's ambassador to America, but more importantly, he was New Zealand's trade minister. And I asked him if the TPP-11 was real, and he said absolutely. And the goal is to preserve that agreement in the highest form possible, keep it as close to what the United States signed, get it into force, and then make it available for the United States to come back as soon as we're ready. Now, the irony of us withdrawing is that American business is very pragmatic. We find ways to do business. So if the United States is not part of TPP or another mega regional trade agreement being negotiated called RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which includes 16 countries, China, India, the 10 ASEANs, Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand. So the rules are being written in these 2 mega deals, and America does not have a seat at the table. But our companies have to find a way to do business, so we will. So the irony of America pulling out of these agreements is that, I believe, that's going to result in forcing American manufacturing jobs offshore. I think we're going to be forced to move to the TPP-11 or the RCEP countries in order to benefit from those tariff reductions and elimination and from those high standard rules in the case of TPP-11. So I'm sorry for that long-winded answer, but what's at stake? Everything.
Excellent. Well, I have some follow-up questions to that, but let me bring Scott in for a rebuttal. No, seriously, I assume you agree with most of that, but can you also talk about the broader conditions behind these agreements in the region and the sort of uncertainty that's out there about economics and politics?
Sure. Thanks, Matt. And thanks, Tammy. I actually would agree with everything Tammy said. American business, globally engaged American business, has an abiding interest in Asia, in the Asia-Pacific, for very simple reasons. That's the future of everybody's business because that's where the consumers are. Already, the global middle class is located in the Asia-Pacific, and it will continue to grow. So to the extent your company is in the business of serving consumers, whatever they may be, around the world, you need to be in Asia. And American firms know that. They've organized themselves to do that. And my confidence that American corporate interest in the Asia-Pacific will continue over time. Now, thinking where we stand now in the world economy and the economy in Asia, it's kind of a bad time for us to be absent. Mainly because, well, think of it this way. 2007, the year before we created the financial crisis that crashed the world economy for a while, 2007, import demand was pretty much industrial nation driven. 2/3 of global imports were imported into the United States, Japan, or the European Union. So we were the draw from the rest of the world, those big industrial developed economies. Trade collapsed in 2008, beginning 2009, slowly recovered. the world economy did not really recover. And importantly, those big import-consuming markets grew much more slowly post-recession than pre-recession. That lack of aggregate import demand had a big effect in Asia. The two biggest effects were, first, China, which was sort of factory Asia at the time, or the center of assembly, started to slow dramatically because of the lack of import demand. China's slowing down reduced commodity demand, and the super cycle of commodities ended with a bang, not a whimper. Those two factors are still playing out and causing what I'd characterize as the big sort in Asia of, okay, how do I grow now? Okay, if it's not export-led industrialization, if it's not commodity production at high prices, what do I do with my economy? Where do we go? Where do businesses go? And that uncertainty is, I think, manifesting itself in the lack of agreement on a set of rules going forward. So for me, no question American business still remains interested. But second, wouldn't this be a great time to be involved in shaping sort of how this does go forward and how the big sort works itself out and economies get their footing again post this tough recession? But that's not happening. So.
Before we go through the alphabet soup or talk about TPP and the other specific agreements, just, inspired by what you just said, I'm thinking about, is really is this story that we've been talking about global supply chains and therefore the sort of the arrangements that governments need to negotiate to support those global trends, is that really the main directional trend still for business, or is it at least being countered to some extent by a sort of a localization effort, as well as outgoing chairman of GE, Jeff Immelt, suggested? We're really in a mode of moving things into sort of localized production into localized markets and becoming, a collection of localized businesses. Is that a different thing? Is that happening? Is that something that is meaningful? Does it affect this trade debate? Maybe Tammy or Scott?
I think the answer is yes, both. Global supply chains are still in effect, and we're going to see that play out as the U.S. Works with Mexico and Canada to modernize NAFTA. But I think it is true that we're seeing companies invest in local economies, and GE's investment in France and using the French version of the Exim Bank to help finance it. I mean, those are realities. So yes, I think both are happening and both are true. Scott?
Yeah, I would agree with that. Look, from a policy standpoint, firms have committed to global supply chains. They've built their businesses. They've created these networks based on mutual benefit of the partners, but also the rule set that was in place. On the policy side, the rules are gradually being unwound. And you can go to Global Trade Alert, which is this little bitty NGO in Geneva that tracks trade measures reported to the WTO, and they do a very good job of capturing all the new slick little protectionist tools that various WTO members try. And the trend is really obvious. There's been an accumulation of protectionist measures, about 5 times as many trade restricting measures as trade liberalizing measures since the Great Recession. This is the sign of now that we've created these global networks, and we've benefited from them as consumers through low prices, as companies through improved competitiveness. The tendency is for them to unwind rather than even remain stable.
Okay, on TPP. So, Scott, do you think that a TPP 11 is in the U.S. business interest? Is it something that, because we're not going to directly benefit except insofar as we're already investing in some of those markets that are benefiting, if it were possible, is that a good thing in itself? And then, in terms of the path back to the U.S., but I'm talking about just sort of economically, commercially, a good thing.
Accepting that the optimal, which is a TPP 12, is not available at the moment. I get that. TPP 11 is actually the next best thing to do. Now, for industrial producers, if you're a manufacturer or exporter, you get hurt. And this is why the agriculture community was so incensed with the president's decision to pull out of TPP. They were the biggest immediate losers. But if you have a business model like that, as Tammy pointed out, if you are outside the preference scheme, okay, you lose. However, a lot of American service providers have not been excluded. So two things happen. One is, it's actually really hard to discriminate against service providers who have physical location in one of the partner countries. So, go back into the services chapter, into the schedules, and read what a Japanese bank is. Okay, you'll find out that Citi is a Japanese bank. J.P. Morgan is a Japanese bank for the purposes of TPP 11. Okay, so those firms will be okay. More importantly, somehow these rules get in place, and they're practiced in the world. So let's think of digital economy. In an earlier conference a month or two ago, I described the TPP digital economy chapter as all dressed up and no place to go. There's this great set of rules that are applied absolutely nowhere. Okay, well, at least you have 11 economies, okay, applying these general rules which provide non-discriminatory treatment, which force the countries to behave in a least trade restrictive manner with new regulation, have all these benefits. So those benefits are available to anybody, whether you're a participant in the TPP or not, and those are good things. So from that standpoint, suboptimal, but probably the least worst next scenario.
Before I come back to you, Tammy, let me just ask the reverse question. Is RCEP in any way a threat to American business interests? And I'm presuming that something somewhat meaningful in RCEP happens, and I'm gonna preempt your soundbite about India. Let's presume that India is not the usual spoiler that it is, but it actually supports something that is a little more meaningful. What does that mean for American businesses? And then I'll ask you.
Okay, I'm a business guy. I'm not normally a unicorn rainbow type, but look, RCEP does no harm. Ultimately, RCEP is a set of rules for production in the 16 economies that operate that way. I've always seen RCEP as a consolidating effort. Keep in mind, there are already supposedly FTAs in place among all these parties. So there's not a lot of new liberalization. Perhaps there are some gains in what gets scheduled. More importantly, the schedules will actually match. I mean, compare the tariff lines in the ASEAN-India agreement with the ASEAN-China agreement. They don't match. Guess what? That makes life hard for anybody who's trying to do business in the region. So come up with one tariff schedule, one harmonized tariff schedule that's in the schedules. Boy, that would help a lot of people. So those kinds of benefits are available. Is it going to be deeper liberalization? Not initially, perhaps because it creates an ecosystem that'll develop. That'll be good. Does it fix all the problems? Probably not really, but.
Your members worry about RCEP?
No, we agree with Scott that, the rising tide lifts all ships. The companies will use whatever they can, and anything that harmonizes the spaghetti bowl is a good thing for business.
Has so much to talk about. But let me ask about NAFTA, because that seems to be the bird in the hand, or the thing that people are focused on here in town, and the administration seems to be prioritizing. I mean, first of all, business, including the chamber, I think, was instrumental in trying to get the administration or the president specifically, not to tear up NAFTA at one critical moment. Why is that? And on the other hand, do you think there are things in NAFTA that need to be improved?
Well, NAFTA is 23, 24 years old, so yes, it needs to be modernized. I would argue that we did that as part of TPP, but since the U.S. has withdrawn, the opportunity to add the Internet did not exist when NAFTA was concluded initially, so there are many things that can be improved. Excuse me, and yes, the U.S. business community strongly supports NAFTA. NAFTA, as you saw from the chart, showed the depth of our trade with Canada and Mexico. They are our two largest trade partners, and it really is we have seamless operations with our companies in the three markets, so it is hugely important. 14 million jobs depend on it. So yes, Tom Donohue's his main line on NAFTA is first, do no harm.
on NAFTA. How do you think this is going to unfold? Are we going to get meaningful progress in NAFTA, and is it going to help business?
Well, look, I mean, it's really, how this comes out is really important. Look, 30% of U.S. trade is with Mexico and Canada. 30%, okay? I mean, if you were trying to pick something that you could go screw up and really do damage to the American economy, you couldn't choose better than NAFTA, okay? So the fact is the downside risk is immense just because of the significance of these two parties. Okay, second, I think the Federal Register notice process has probably opened some eyes with the administration because there was lots of talk from Secretary Ross, less so from Lighthizer because I think he knew what he was doing. But Secretary Ross was all about, we're going to wrap this up in 90 days and bully these two trading partners into what we want and have it done. And yeah, that'll be fun. Now they got 12,000 Federal Register notice comments. 12,000. Actually, it crashed the site. So NAFTA renegotiation already broke the internet earlier this week. They actually extended the comment period by a day or two. But go back, you don't have to look at the public comments to know that there is no consensus about what to do with NAFTA, all right? Just look at the questions asked by Senate Finance Committee members during Ambassador Lighthizer's confirmation, okay? So this is not short, this is not easy, okay? Because nobody wants to go tell Chairman Hatch we couldn't fix the promise doctrine, the promise utility doctrine in Canadian patent law because we were too busy, okay? Nobody wants to tell Ranking Member Wyden that we couldn't do anything about softwood lumber because we were busy with other stuff. Okay, so this negotiation is going to be very difficult. Both the trading partners are professional about this. They've recognized that it's vitally important to them as well. They want to do a good job with this. There's a lot of thoughtful people with both our trading partners who will work to make this thing better. But I wouldn't expect short, and I hope we get our act together because, look, I understand that NAFTA is the worst agreement in the history of Earth, but nobody from the president on down has ever said what precisely is wrong with it and what precisely would you do to make it better and how is that in the U.S. interest. That'll need to happen because sooner or later an implementing bill's got to pass the Congress.
Assuming you agree NAFTA is going to be a challenging undertaking, how much bandwidth does that leave for other things, including other bilaterals, including with Japan, and what does the Chamber think about
Well, first, we think Japan's wonderful.
about FTA?
And we would support a U.S.-Japan FTA. However, I think you hit the nail on the head. Bandwidth is going to be limited. I think I completely agree with Scott that this administration is going to be all consumed with trying to do NAFTA and to do it well. It's not going to be easy, and it's certainly not going to be quick. I think while the U.S. administration has declared a strong preference for bilaterals, and initially Secretary Ross was talking about with Canada and Mexico, we would have two symmetrical bilaterals. I think they have moved away from, they've evolved past that to understand that perhaps it really it does serve America best to be a trilateral. Well, hopefully, their understanding of how to negotiate these, that delicate balance of wins and losses in an FTA will be furthered. In our discussions with our Japanese interlocutors, I don't really sense a strong desire to do a bilateral agreement. Primarily because we did one already. We did a parallel agreement on the side of TPP. Combine them together and you have a U.S.-Japan bilateral FTA. But it really is difficult to balance those gains and losses that both countries were able to achieve when you're just doing it with two countries. 12 countries, I know the administration likes to say that a large economy can really pressure a smaller economy and we can get a better deal. To me, I don't see how that works. First of all, I don't see a lot of countries lining up to want to do bilaterals with us. If you have announced your stated objective as the largest economy in the world to squeeze your partner, why would anyone want to get in a room with you? And then also, I think that they're finding out that this is a lot harder than people in the administration perhaps expected.
Can I shift to another thing? The other thing that seems to be a priority for the administration, in addition to NAFTA, is enforcement and sort of a range of issues, from anti-dumping CVD cases to the 232 national security review on which there may be news this week. Apparently, this is these cases against steel in steel and aluminum. This is got to be a sort of an area of some dispute within your membership, because some people are going to benefit from this potential set of enforcement actions, and the steel and aluminum sectors, among others, may actually think this is a good idea to move down this path. How do you think about that? How do you address those different interests?
Well, I think the U.S. business community believes that all deals should be honored fully and in their entirety. So we support these enforcement actions. You mentioned earlier the chorus agreement. The president has tweeted that perhaps we need to renegotiate that agreement. We've done extensive outreach to our companies, and the message for them is the agreement as written is a very solid, good agreement, and we support that agreement. But we do believe there's an opportunity to improve implementation and enforcement. So, when it comes to certain specific enforcement actions, the Chamber does sometimes have companies on both sides of the table, and in those situations, we normally stay neutral. But when it comes to trade agreements, our CEO, Tom Donahue, loves to say they're not worth the paper they're printed on if they're not fully enforced. So we support the administration's focus on enforcement.
I remember a time back in the good old days with Japan when somebody challenged USTR to produce the actual 48 agreements or whatever that they touted they had reached with Japan, and they couldn't actually find the pieces of paper, in the files. Those were days before the internet, but it was literally, I think the chamber in Tokyo, the ACCJ, did a study or a report on that. So Scott, do you want to say something about enforcement?
Well, I think it's probably the most predictable thing that this administration is doing, perhaps on any policy area. This is something that was promised in the campaign. It is their orientation. We have a U.S. Trade Representative and a Secretary of Commerce who are both very concerned about the U.S. industrial base, and trade remedy law is probably their favorite tool. I'm also not surprised to see the self-initiation. I would note that, and what I'm going to watch carefully for, particularly in the 232 investigations, is what are the actions? What are the remedies? Now, look, doing an investigation on national security is not in and of itself harmful, particularly when you've chosen to do it in a segment of the economy which has global overcapacity problems. So, looking and in fact, if all they did was through this investigation is learn the critical national security elements of the steel and aluminum supply chain, they'd probably be further ahead in some negotiations. However, I think this administration will lean toward managed trade, and in its manifestations. And I think one of the possible applications of the findings from the 232 investigation would be the kind of managed trade. Now, everybody will remind me immediately afterwards. All my friends who study the WTO will remind me that in the safeguards agreement, we agreed not to use quantitative measures. I would rather point out to them that last week the U.S. and Mexico agreed to a quantitative measures in sugar. That's called a suspension agreement. They called it a suspension agreement. It is managed trade, okay? And I think those kinds of outcomes would be desirable in the mind of Secretary Ross. Obviously, Ambassador Lighthizer, when he was deputy USTR, was a practitioner in this particular area. So that's the space I'm watching carefully going forward.
Yeah, sure.
If I could just make a comment, and I agree with everything Scott's saying. I have concerns about that direction because when we were at the APEC Trade Ministerial a couple weeks ago in Hanoi, what we are hearing from our other APEC partners is if the U.S. is going protectionist, why shouldn't they? In fact, there were 2 different countries, one a TPP country and one a non-TPP country, who, when we raised a particular issue, it was an electronic payment issue. The TPP country said, yes, we know, we agreed to resolve that in TPP, but President Trump doesn't like TPP, so we no longer feel obligated to our commitment. And then a non-TPP country who had raised their hand and said they were very interested in joining TPP, we raised that same issue and they laughed and said, look, we're not going to fix that. We don't really care. And if the U.S. is becoming more protectionist, you know, you are validating what we're doing.
Okay, I want to give the audience a chance, but let me just ask maybe 2 more questions. One is shifting gears a little bit. Congressman Larson, in his opening keynote, talked about, he's pro-trade and thinks we need to make the case for that, and, he finds it, possible to do that in his constituency, but his constituents also want to hear about what we're doing about, the changes in the economy and particularly the nature of work. Right. And that seems to be a necessary part of getting back on a pro-trade path, which I think we all agree is the direction, that the U.S. has an interest in getting back on. It seems like we have to find better solutions than just, $1 billion of TAA or something, a trade adjustment assistance. Yeah. What are, I mean, I want to ask both of you that, so in either order,
It's a great point. Look, the U.S. economy has benefited massively from globalization. Peterson Institute updates this study. Huffpower does it all the time. Very solidly done, but trillions of dollars of gains for the United States because of globalization. But in those gains are some dislocations. You can't deny it. The ratio even may be like 40-to-1 of the losses, individual losses with dislocation to the gains. However, those individual losses are powerful, they are focused, they are intense, and we as an economy and as a government do a crappy job of really helping people who are not 18 years old and not 65 adjust to the changes in the economy. Now, adjustment is actually going to accelerate and going to speed up. Everything you read about autonomous vehicles. Remember, one of the largest, there are as many truck drivers in America as there are people working in the auto industry. Okay? Today, yeah, okay? Just so adjustment is going to happen. All right, we need to do a better job of it. There are wonderful examples at the local level. I was writing for my blog this week on South Carolina, and the Germans are well known for their apprenticeships and those programs. BMW, because it needs skilled employees in their South Carolina assembly plant, has started apprentice programs just straight out of Germany with 2 community colleges in the area. The programs are full. People are satisfied with what they learn. They're able to become skilled technicians in very high-paying but high-skilled jobs, and it's working. So for me, I think the real task in Washington is don't try to create a federal program, but go learn what's working and try to replicate it as fast as you can, as broadly as you can.
We are trying to bring that conversation here to CSIS, so stay tuned for more on that. But the point about truck drivers was that it's a big employer today, but 10 years from now, there may be 0 truck drivers in the United States because of technology. Tammy, what is business doing about this?
Well, we recognize it's a big problem. We have a workforce initiative. We're trying to work with our companies, and we have to take care of those people who've been left behind. A lot of those folks, there are the mismatch between jobs that are available and the workforce skill set is striking. So I think there's a lot more that needs to be done, and but it can't be the government, and it can't be just the government, and it can't be just business. We have to work together, and again, no one clearly has the answer yet.
Okay, I have another sort of set of questions, but I think I need to give the audience a little chance here to weigh in because we really do have a hard stop at 1. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. A microphone will appear magically, and please do ask a question. I'm going to go back there first and then to Chris.
Yeah, I'm Andreas Falke. I teach international political economy at the University of Erlangen-Nuremberg in Germany. I'm here at the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies. My question is, what does the prospect of the EU and Japan finalizing its FTA, probably this summer, before the G20 summit in Hamburg, how will this affect the US policy?
Okay.
You raise an excellent point. The EU has really accelerated their bilateral activity in Asia. And again, when the U.S. cedes leadership and basically withdraws from the playing field, what we see is our EU friends who have very different standards and regulatory requirements, and makes it very difficult for our companies to compete in an easier way. So I think it's going to make it much harder.
No, that's right. And frankly, we've seen this movie before in the United States. We negotiated a very high standard agreement with Korea and then sat on it for 5 years. Okay, in the meantime, Europe started, concluded, and implemented a free trade agreement with Korea. And there's a lot of industrial goods, a lot of sophisticated products, which are important exports from the United States and also important exports from Europe, particularly Germany. And so what Europe is doing is managing their own interests very well, and we're sitting on the sidelines complaining. I actually read Secretary Ross complaining about the fact that Mexico could export Volkswagens to Europe at 0 tariff, but the Tennessee plant for Volkswagen faced a 10% tariff, and how unfair that was. And nobody bothered to tell him it's because Mexico has a free trade agreement with Europe and the United States doesn't. So congratulations. I hope it goes well for you. We'll learn one of these days.
Chris.
Oh, thanks. Chris Nelson, Nelson Report. TPP 11, is there a U.S. business role in any organized way to try to help Japan and Vietnam and the other sort of leaders of this get to where they want to go? Or is it really more of as Tammy, you're pointing out, individual businesses, they're going to do business because they got to do business, is what they do. But I'm looking for possibly a more coherent American role in creating new conditions that may penetrate the minds, if you can use that word, of the Trump administration. Thank you.
Which word can we?
Minds, yes.
Make sure I got that.
I use it loosely.
I was being facetious.
You ask a very interesting question, and I would say the jury's still out on that.
As an example, would be involved in the TPP 11 process, have points of view. That's obviously American companies located in Japan. And that may be replicated with the American-Australian Chamber of Commerce, those kinds of things. So I do think the American business is probably making its views known, but they're doing it through their local chambers where they have the most to say about it.
Other questions? Yes, sir. I want to make sure I catch everybody.
Hello, Scott, Tammy. This is Dave Salmonson with American Farm Bureau. We have the structure of TPA to basically govern congressional administrative relations on trade. But can either of you discern any particular now or growing in the future congressional consensus on trade and how they're going to interact with the administration?
That's a broader question, but can we just, for the sake of people who aren't trade geeks, just remind people what the status of Trade Promotion Authority is? Is it still in effect? Could we negotiate things under the current TPA? And then answer the broader the question about Congress.
The answer is yes. It was authorized in 2015 for five years with a possible extension for another 2, as I recall.
So we don't have to go through that debate again.
No, no, it exists for this president.
Okay, but what about congressional sentiment on trade? Is there,
I haven't seen enough yet to say, but I do know that particularly in the Senate, there is a lot of concern, actually thanks to the voice and the importance of Republican farm state senators who are quite concerned about the trade policy and are acting in ways to try to examine what's going on and get a look at it. I understand the Finance Committee will meet with Ambassador Lighthizer this week, or next week, I'm sorry. Also, Senator Thune, who chairs the Commerce Committee, wants to hear from probably the Secretary of Commerce on his plans for the 232 investigations. So oversight is the most important step here. Certainly, with the NAFTA comment period now closed, but the consultation period open, the administration is going to have to tell Congress precisely what they're trying to accomplish in the NAFTA, and Congress will have its views known through the hearing process or through more direct means. So I'm expecting this to ramp up. At the moment, we've been saved from even worse things by the Aggies. So thank you, and the importance of agriculture exports to these farm states and low prices, which they're suffering from now, is an important dynamic in this, one that Ambassador Lighthizer is well aware of. But exactly how that relationship works, I just haven't seen enough. Maybe Tammy will have another review.
And I'm going to
I think NAFTA is going to give us a good window into what that looks like, but it's early days.
The one trade-related issue that is, or trade-impacting issue that is possibly going to be discussed in Congress is this border adjustment tax, the notion of something to pay for the other tax reforms or tax cuts that are being sought. Assuming the overall tax debate goes forward, is a border adjustment tax something that is likely to happen? Is it a good thing? I think your members are probably a little split on this.
You're exactly right. We have members who feel very strongly on both sides, so the chamber is neutral on that.
Well, Chairman Brady had a public meeting yesterday where he actually talked about the possibility of phasing in the border adjustment tax over a 5-year period. So it's still under discussion. I'm not sure there are votes to get out of the committee yet, but the most important element is the one Tammy mentioned, which is if the business community is divided, tax reform is in trouble. All right?
Broader tax, not just this issue.
Broader tax reform, and particularly corporate tax reform. Until you get a set of principles and a set of mechanisms that the broad American business community supports, getting tax reform, which I think is probably the #1 priority for American competitiveness, is almost impossible to do. And right, the unfortunate part about the border adjusted tax is it splits the business community.
I have a quick comment and a quick question.
Who are you?
Sorry, Ira Shapiro, Shapiro Global. The quick comment is, I've been looking at American politics in this period of dysfunction, and about the healthiest debate that we had in the United States in the last 8 years was on TPA. The only time that I can find that the Democratic president and the Republicans in Congress, the leaders of the Republican Party, worked together. And that was largely because of the Senate role in it, but not exclusively. So that's the quick comment. The quick question is, in a trade debate where everyone really operates out of conviction on one side or the other, I think the exception has been the U.S. auto companies, and I'd be interested in your view of their perspective on trade at this point, because I found it to be completely unhelpful in the TPP process.
Well, I'm not sure I would agree with that completely because, but there is one particular auto company who had a very strong view on the need for TPP to include enforceable currency provisions. And the U.S. Chamber's view on currency is a trade agreement is not the appropriate place to deal with it. We don't dispute that some economies do use they manipulate their currencies for export gain, but we didn't, and we thought the way it was addressed in TPP, there was a side agreement where, but it was non-binding, and but it was an annual meeting, sort of a name and shame, but that was not enough to support that to win that one company over. But I think now looking at the trade debate, all of our auto companies are global auto companies, and they use the global supply chain. So I think their role in the NAFTA debate is actually helpful. So
the trade policy split was not new. In fact, you go back to the auto ITAC. I think it's ITAC 2, ITAC 3. There was a report about the U.S.-Korea FTA. And the split in the auto industry was evident in that report. Because, in fact, it was obvious in Korea because you had General Motors, which owned Daewoo, right? And Ford, which was having such a difficult time, they were about to exit the business at the time of the U.S.-Korea FTA. So this split it's been there. Industry splits happen, okay? In the case of the NAFTA, though, I would note that the Detroit Three are completely aligned, and in fact, they're the ones who are pushing back the hardest on Secretary Ross's instincts to renegotiate rules of origin and change them. So they are unified in that particular way.
Since we have Japanese friends in the room and currency issues are sometimes an area of interest for them, is the currency issue now, for now, not an issue in the sense that, despite the campaign promises, President Trump's Treasury Secretary did not name anybody a currency manipulator, including China or Japan, or is this is this coming back, and is it coming back potentially as an enforceable provision in FTAs that we seek going forward?
Look, currency is going to remain an issue because it does affect the balance of payments. It does affect the value and the level of trade preferences that come from subsidized currencies. So it's going to remain an issue. I would point out that our colleagues up the street at the Peters Institute, Fred Bergson, just published a book on how to handle currency manipulation without trade rules. So I would call that to your attention. I've always been a skeptic about including currency in trade rules for the same reason I tend not to toss the car keys and a bottle of whiskey to teenage boys and tell them to have fun. It is potentially subject to capture by interested industries if it's in a trade agreement. Or that happens too often. In this case, Bergson and Gagnon have proposed basically a Treasury Department driven, where you essentially, if someone's manipulating their currency, you go into the market and buy it. The U.S. takes a position in the currency and countervails the value, pushes up the value, and if you're right about it being undervalued in the first place, the Treasury makes money. So lucky strike extra.
Yeah, I remember, many of you know Mustafa Mohatarem, who was the chief economist at GM for a long time. No longer. Is he still there? I don't know. Anyway, he used to come regularly, sort of annually, when I was at Treasury or pretty much anywhere else, and say, we need to go after Japan for currency manipulation. And then, although he stopped doing that eventually because they were selling enough cars in China, but he at one point, when there was a proposal to put the currency manipulation finding in the Commerce Department, he said, "Oh my God, why would we want that? It's like giving the car keys and the alcohol." He said Commerce would screw that up and wouldn't be. So even though he wanted tougher enforcement of this provision. So I think careful what you wish for. Any other final burning questions in the room? I want to make sure. Yes, ma'am, in the back.
Hi, Arbor Johnson with Itochu. This is sort of a whole other can of worms, but quick comments on the economic repercussions of the U.S. leaving the Paris Agreement, particularly maybe vis-a-vis Asia.
Yeah, I mean, are those, at any level, but I mean, business maybe is losing opportunities out of this.
Yes, but more so, I think it's damaging to, it's viewed in Asia as yet another indication of American isolationism and sort of walking away from leadership, and makes all of our friends in Asia very nervous. And as one very senior Asian leader told me recently, when one loses an old friend, one makes a new friend. And then he said, "I'm on my way to Beijing for the One Belt, One Road. Bye-bye."
Speaking of which, I had wanted to ask about OBOR, but we're out of time unless you have any final
just one thing, I agree with Tammy on the negative effects of withdrawing from treaties like this. It's bad form when you want to make new agreements with new partners. However, I would point out that there's going to be a diverging cost structure in energy between the United States and Europe. Energy costs for transport and electric generation are declining in the United States. They're rising in Europe, in part because of policy. So I just say watch that space.
Okay, excellent. Really interesting discussion, much more fun than having a keynote speaker at lunch, which we traditionally do. So thank you both. Please join me in thanking Tammy and Scott. Terrific. And with that, I think final benediction. Thank you all for coming. This is all going to be on our site within 24 hours, including the PowerPoints, or 36 hours. Thanks, Tammy. And thank you for coming, and come again. Bye-bye. And sorry, thank you, JETRO, again, for making this possible. Appreciate it.